Okay, I'll start just so we get some housekeeping items going and some other folks can enter as they finishing up signing in, etc. So I'm Tim Foy. I'm with Visa Group out of Philadelphia and the current education chair. I always like to ask everyone, if you had any interest in being a chair, let us know. There's plenty of room for participation. So I'm very lucky because we have 15 folks on the committee, and I'll introduce those names and their companies in a bit. But just wanted to welcome everyone. We have about 100 people that are in person live, which is fantastic. And we have about a dozen people that are calling in virtually. So thanks to everyone, whether you're here in person or whether you're online listening to the sessions today. Just some items, the attendance list for those interested, event materials, and the recorded sessions will be available on the PAMIC website after the conclusion of the seminar. CE credits are being provided. I believe it's 4 that have been filed and approved. If you're attending in person, please be sure to sign in and sign out. And that paper, of course, is right outside the door where Becky is sitting. And so you have to sign out after the presentations today, as well as signing in. If you're attending virtually, very important, there will be polls that pop up per session. Please be sure to answer those as they come through. These are the only ways to receive credits. So again, for those that are online, very important that you look for the pop-up screens and answer those so you get credit for your CE. Please note there's hand sanitizer and masks at the registration table if needed. And we're following the COVID-19 protocols that you probably saw in our registration materials. As I said, if anyone had an interest, PAMIC has many of the committees with many different topics. Ours is Education Committee. We primarily do this, the annual spring conference, and we do the executive board roundtable in June. So, but if you have other interests, like from IT or HR or things like that, feel free to see Brittany or Becky to participate. We have sponsors that we are very grateful. I'll read those off in the different categories. Without them, such events are not possible. From a platinum category, it's Donegal Insurance Group, Gallagher Re, Gen Re, Guy Carpenter, HSB Munich Re, Mutual Boiler Re, New England Asset Management, and Pennsylvania Lumbermen's Mutual Insurance Company. For the signature category, we have Brown, Schultz, Sheridan, and Fritz. We have Tuscarora Wayne Insurance, Berkeley Re Solutions, Travelers Boiler Re, and Westmont Associates, Inc. And for the program category, we have FHL Bank out of Pittsburgh, Mutual Benefit Group, Mutual Capital Analytics, Opus Investment Management. So to give them a round of applause, because again, with their sponsors, for those who don't know where the restrooms are, you just go out the doors and they're to the right, where the breakfast was this morning. As far as, I just wanted to read off the committee members real quick. Some of them include the PAMIC members too that have been very, very active in putting this together today. So Brittany Barco of PAMIC, Kathy Brennan from Berkeley Re, Chris Airsman from HSB, Becky Ferris from PAMIC, Kevin Finn from Mutual Analytics, Ron Gallagher, our director, of course. Ron's been very active in securing speakers. Bala Kumar from Jatos Tech, Marianne Lance from MMG, Bill McGettigan from FHL Bank, Melissa Peace Tomanio from Morgan Atkins, Sue Quimby from MSO, Scott Rubenstein from Guy Carpenter, Laura Sharp from PAMIC, and Dave Thomas from Guy Carpenter. So again, give a round of applause to all the folks that have helped put this together today. As far as you probably saw the in the materials, the different topics, we're going to kick it off with the future of the workplace, which I think we all find quite interesting with the last 2 years, what we've all been going through. We have Homeland Security, perspectives for building security, capacity, capability, and resilience. We have growing commercial lines, opportunities to expand in a profitable marketplace. We have crisis management for workplace, incidents in small business. We have property damage resulting from weather changes. And that's our last program for today. I just want to give everyone a heads up in case you didn't see the agenda. So we're going to start off with the future of the workplace. And we'll start off with our speaker is Patrick from Hartford Mutual Insurance Company, Patrick Gagan, and Thomas Korber from Penn National. There are 2 panelists for this one. So Patrick and Thomas are here. Patrick, I'll let you do your own intro if that's okay. You're allowed to sit here if you wish. Or
I don't know. People won't be able to see me back there. So. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm a loud talker, so I'm not going to try to get too close to this microphone. So thank you for taking the time. Really looking forward to having this conversation. I'm the head of HR for Hartford Mutual Insurance Group. So I'll give you a little bit of where we were and then where we are today. And then we'll kind of dive into the future of the workplace. So like many companies, March 2020, we shut the doors on all 170 employees, went fully virtual. And it was a week by week process. We didn't know when we left in March, we thought, oh, we'll be back in a month. That month went by, oh, we'll be back in 3 months. And then realization probably started to set in for everybody, like we're not gonna be in for a very long time. And really what we focused on was communication with our employees, making sure they had the appropriate setup to do what they needed to do remotely. But more important, it was the constant communication throughout that process. Without that, they would have been somewhat lost on an island. And then it's starting to get to more mental health well-being. People balancing children in school, being a school teacher, being a parent, being an employee, how they're managing all that. You know, you got employees working until 11 o'clock at night. So that focus really turned into, as we rolled into 2021, is how do we somewhat return to a normal while still being remote, and really starting to really set some more practical guidelines and policies and practices to help our employees manage that process. Happy to say, like many companies, we started setting milestones of, hey, in 2021, we're going to open up the office in July. We thought this would be perfect. Well, then obviously things start to happen again. We pushed it to September. We pushed it again. So finally, we're announced last week that we'll be opening the offices come April. But we did do some things intermediary to start getting employees back in the office based on a voluntary basis. We started with management first, getting them used to the aspect of being in the office, but then working with employees that are home. And then voluntarily, we asked employees to start returning. Again, 100% voluntary, and we actually got a pretty decent turnout. April 4th, we announced we're going back. We're going to be going back to a hybrid environment, like a lot of companies are starting to look at. And what does that mean to our companies? It'd be much different what hybrid means to other companies. We really took a pulse surveys throughout the whole time. We made the decision of, hey, if we're going to go hybrid environment, we know employees aren't going to come in on a Friday. You know, it's going to be very scarce. So we said, you know what, Fridays are going to be virtual Fridays. That kind of leaves you Monday through Thursday. And we really left it up to the managers and supervisors really to determine what would work best from a collaboration standpoint. So if you're going to have employees come in, make sure it's meaningful and impactful. Try to get as many people in the office on those days so you have really good concentration of interaction with individuals. And then corporately, we're also looking at doing what we call culture days. You know, the big stretch, especially on the mutual side of the house, we really pride ourselves in the culture of the organizations. That's been somewhat lost. When you go fully remote, there is that lack of connectivity amongst the employees and even to a certain extent, the community, because a lot of the things are run out of the office. So we're bringing that stuff back in with the emphasis of hopefully bringing employees back in on those days to be able to have that level of interaction. It's going to be very, and I hate to use the term, it's a term we use a lot now, it's going to be very fluid for a period of time. You know, you may have some employees not comfortable coming in right away. So it's going to be a kind of a staged process. Say, hey, why don't you do 1 day a week? See what that feels like, manage what you have going on at home, and then hopefully start to get them in. Hopefully, as employees start to come back in, that hesitancy about coming to the office will decrease and word of mouth will spread and more employees will feel more comfortable coming into the office. So that's where we are moving forward. You know, the lucky part was 20 and 21, we had the best years of our 179-year history of the organization. So the good side is we did it really well. The bad side is we proved to all our employees that we can do this fully remote. So it's kind of hard to ask people to come back into the office full time. But really, when you look at it, every industry is facing this. We had a discussion last night with some of the colleagues and peers throughout the insurance industry. I don't see us ever going back 5 days a week in the office. You'll have some employees that will do that, but the majority of your folks aren't going to do that anymore. And the new talent that's coming in, when you're recruiting, they're not looking to come into the office 5 days a week. That's a no sell during a recruiting process these days. So you really got to be mindful of that, especially in the insurance industry, as we start to see turnover from a retirement standpoint. You got to be able to bring talent in, and we're all fighting for the same talent. So if you're not offering something that's pretty logical across the board in terms of being flexible from a hybrid work environment, you're going to lose those folks. And even more importantly, during that recruiting process, if you're not maintaining contact with those folks, you're going to lose them. We talk a lot about, hey, onboarding is really critical. I think the biggest critical piece now is offer acceptance to the day they walk in the door. Reason why? They're at least getting 4 or 5 offers between that time frame. That's how competitive the job market is right now. We've had situations where I've got a candidate a week away from starting. I got an offer. We got to make a decision from a business standpoint, but if you're not communicating the hiring managers, this isn't an HR responsibility. This is a company responsibility. But more importantly, the hiring manager got to be interacting with those people before they start with you, because you don't know what's going on in that dark period between, again, offer acceptance to the day they walk in the office. Much more diligent, much more forward thinking in terms of what you need to do from a communication and interaction standpoint. So that's a little bit about what we're doing. I'm going to go ahead, hand it over to Tom, and walk through what they've been doing over at Penn National.
Good morning. You know, there's a lot of universality to what you're hearing. I think many of you are experiencing what Patrick's been sharing as well. I think we've had a little bit of a unique journey within Penn National because we already had very well-established business continuity plans pre-pandemic. We've already had work from home flexibility policies pre-pandemic. So it was more of the notion of the abruptness with which the entire company became flexible. So that was our starting point. One of our challenges was, once we realized it was the first iteration of it's time to start to figure out how to bring people back to the office, we launched a pop-up team. And this was, oh, sorry. Thank you. This was as a result of, the assumption that we'd be coming back relatively soon after being launched to working from home. So our pop-up team format is, to solve business problems within 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, and then bring those solutions to bear. So that pop-up team was formed about 1.5 years ago, and they're still fully functioning on a weekly basis. We only disbanded them quite recently. But, we looked at all the issues around the protocols, the hygienes, the CDC guidance, et cetera. So now we've worked through all of the parameters of working differently throughout the pandemic period. And now, like all of you, we're working through what does it mean to come back together in new and different ways, in new and different schedules. What we're realizing, as Patrick was highlighting, is, flexibility is the key. We're now helping our managers define and come to terms with the flexibility. I don't think the employees will struggle at all. I think the burden now is on managers. How do you manage a workforce that has individual expectations and individual definitions of what they prefer, and how do we navigate and become cohesive again? Because that's the cultural risk, if you will. When I think about what's happened in the last couple of years, we have probably 50 individuals who are hired who have never yet stepped foot in our building, right? So the new hires we've brought on board throughout this pandemic experience, they think they're fine. Some of them have articulated that they're looking forward to meeting their colleagues because they've been working in isolation. And they say, but they're okay with having met them on Zoom and on other platforms. But there are still folks for whom they don't recognize, we have some entry-level folks for whom it's their first corporate type experience, and they don't know that this is not normal. Or maybe we as managers don't know that this is the new normal, right? So generationally, how do we look at this? And generationally, how do we interpret this? One of the things that I'm starting to say with our colleagues at Penn National is this is new perhaps for this industry, but it's not new for those from other industries. Because if you think back to the .com era of 1995, 1998, that period, we had the same kinds of market dynamics. We had the same kinds of insistences for individual work schedules, individual preferences to be accommodated in other industries. So while this is disruptive, and it's new for us, it's not new. I believe it's cyclical. So how do we work through the cycles, and how do we help managers understand the cyclicality of this? Especially when we have so many managers in our industry that are from the traditional insurance industry model with such long tenure. So many of us have known one way, one cadence, if you will, and that cadence has been disrupted more so than the talent marketplace has been disrupted. So, we're navigating through a lot of this. But I think the takeaway for me now is looking after the managers and the leaders. It's the hard part now is navigating the flexibility. The employees are going to tell you very vociferously what they want and what they expect. The managers are kind of stuck with trying to figure it out a little bit. So we have to really help the managers move through this.
Are you doing training? Can you hear me? Are you doing training for your managers as far as trying to help them engage with the employees, whether they're newly hired or the existing, long-term ones?
Yeah. So when we talk about training comes in many forms for us. There's the toolkits, if you will, some methods and some processes, the things to consider. So checklists, those kinds of things. But there's also the how do you change the frequency of communications, and how do you change the consistency of communication? So even to the point where sometimes we consider scripting a cascade, so that we get everybody understanding the same definitions of things, the same expectations of things, including what's the expectation around flexibility. So it's almost an oxymoron. We want to have consistency around extreme flexibility, right? So that is a little bit of an oxymoron. So the training comes in the form of communications, toolkits, and engagement.
Good. Patrick, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, really, there's the traditional training. We've brought some folks on through doing virtual training to help our managers and supervisors think differently, because it is different than sitting in front of a group of individuals in a conference room or their office versus a couple folks in the office, a couple folks on a TV. How do you have that interaction? And the bigger concern is, especially when we go to a hybrid environment, natural disposition of folks is to think of people who are in the office, and you have the tendency not to think about those that are not. Out of sight, out of mind. Well, we don't want to limit the opportunities for those individuals that are not always in the office, because they're still doing their job and they're probably doing it very well. So that's the one thing. That's that conscious bias we got to be really careful of with managers and supervisors, is to really think about, hey, just not what's in front of you physically, but what your group is doing as a whole, and making sure you keep those folks in mind in terms of what opportunities present themselves. The other big piece is really helping managers and supervisors not always just getting right into business when they're meeting with folks. It's become more, employees are expecting more of a personal touch in terms of, especially when we have been remote. That was the one thing that we really lost, was we were so focused on the day-to-day of what we needed to do. The employees, whether they realized it or not, they missed that personal interaction that you would get at the water cooler, at the coffee machine, walking down the hallway. So really what we've stressed with our managers and supervisors is, before you start a meeting, ask how everybody's doing. Doesn't cost a lot of money to do that, but it means volume. So no matter how size of your company, there's some really easy things that you can do to make sure that your folks are engaged and are not looking to go elsewhere, and take that time. And then the other big piece that I think managers and supervisors really need to do when they're rounding out a meeting is, what do you need from me? What can I do to help you get your job done? It's that connection piece. It's that personal touch. That's that interaction, whether they're physically in front of you or via Teams or Zoom or WebEx. They know that manager and supervisors engage with them and cares about what they're doing.
You mentioned that from the time offer acceptance happened, you have people who say, I have another offer. Can you share with us like some of the, what's the market offering out there? If you're allowed to say any, or put them in broad categories, what's enticing people to either switch jobs or to come from you from college? What's the carrot? I mean, you're offering trips to Paris. What's the deal? What's the deal to bring them on, to actually have them to show up? Because that's fascinating that people are bailing. I think when a lot of us came out of school and joined the industry, we wouldn't have thought about, hey, not showing up for that first job. So to me, that's a reset of how we all came through.
Yeah, let alone them not showing up. They apply and then you don't get back to them for a week and they're not responding because they're dealing with maybe 4 or 5 other companies through that process. It is an employee-driven market. For the first time in decades, they now somewhat hold an upper hand in terms of their employment status. And some of them are like, if I don't want to go work, I'm not going to go work. I think we had a discussion last night. I think a lot of people reset priorities because of COVID. So they're looking for, in a lot of circumstances, a home that's going to be community engaged, professional development, and ultimately there's obviously total compensation, benefits, comp, rewards, so forth and so on. What we're seeing in the marketplace right now, at least down in Maryland and in our other areas, Comp is driving a fair amount of this right now. If you were to go out and hire someone new, what you're finding out is you have some inequity with your internal staff. And how do you adjust that? Organizationally, we've taken some steps in terms of, hey, this past merit cycle, we really increased our merit bucket for that so we can make sure that we're adjusting appropriately. And I would say we're probably having more discussions organizationally of, hey, we need to really start talking about talent, who they are, especially those that we don't want to lose, and making sure that they're in a good spot. Because if they're not, I can guarantee you they're getting phone calls from 3 or 4 other carriers that says, hey, be more than happy. And again, going back, if you can't provide that flexibility, that's going to be a no deal for a lot of candidates.
Yeah, I think a very similar story for us. We haven't had a lot of candidates leaving us. We did have one scenario where somebody accepted the job and then never showed up on day one, but we've only had one of those, which we're surprised when we hear some of the other anecdotal stories out there. We're aware of the hot jobs, so we know we've had to do some pricing changes for what we call the hot jobs. And as Patrick was highlighting, we're now beginning to recognize we have to also address hot individuals within the organization. And there are a couple of ways we do that. So who are the talented folks that are in the feeder roles to the hot jobs that we've already looked at. But we also know there's that critical turning point at year 1, year 3, and year 5. So we are an organization that has a lot of long tenured folks. So we may have gotten complacent, assuming folks would stay, and because we are a great company, they're a great employee, so therefore everyone's just going to be happy forever. But so that's the unconscious way of managing. What we've become much more conscious about, though, is that 1-year employee, or the 1-year milestone, the 3-year milestone, and the 5-year milestone, and making sure we're really paying attention to the career development, the career aspirations, bridging any gaps. And the way to do that, though, is making sure the managers know their people. We're moving out of what had been an operational cadence to helping managers really put a finger on the pulse of what's going on for each individual. Some folks have lots of things going on at home, which is why they prefer to work from home. But while they're working from home, what are the other nuances of what's going on in the struggles for that individual? We never used to entertain those kinds of things when talking about employees during the work hours. We're now talking about the employee's life. And how are we as managers helping them balance their lives to help them stay productive? So it's becoming much more interpersonal, which I think is the new management model. And I mentioned earlier at the podium, where we're being more thoughtful about how to help managers. It's really sometimes as simple as reminding managers that each person on their team is an individual with individual circumstances going on. And when you look at certain age groups within our population, some of us are the sandwich generation, right? We have elder care and childcare. Some parents are now at-home teachers while also being an employee for us with the Zoom classroom stuff that was going on. So the finger on the pulse of each individual is really new and different as an expectation. It's almost a requirement now of managers.
It's tied to the new hires. Let's talk about retention. I think when we spoke earlier, you mentioned that your retentions are very high. I think everyone here would like to hear about that and why you think it happened, and what are your concerns for the future on retention?
I think part of what helps us right now with retention is the manner in which we manage the workforce. We cared and provided care and well-being for the workforce throughout the pandemic. So the regularity of communications, the regularity of adjusting policies and programs to be safety first, employee well-being next, and also mindful of our customer and business continuity. I don't know that retention's a guarantee, though, right? So we have really good retention right now. However, we still have market dynamics. We still have the awakening of personal choices and the reflections of all employees saying, we've retained our core workforce, but we have seen some of our retirements that were planned get accelerated. So those who were planning to retire in December or January of 2023, some of them have said, I'm just going to go a little earlier. So where we had known departures coming, some of them are accelerated. What I worry about next is the ones we don't know about, or the ones we're not forecasting because of the market dynamics.
Similar to Tom, the one thing that we did during the pandemic was, and this is something that you're starting to see more and more, just not from, early career insurance professionals, but it's that clear understanding of what professional opportunities they are. What is that career path? What does that look like? Before it was just, claims examiner, senior claims examiner, specialist, and managers would just walk through that. Really what we did was across the organization, I challenged some of our future leaders to say, build out with your senior management team, what are the roles within each of the departments? What are the requirements? And let's visually put that pen to paper so that employees can really visually see what that looks like. But part of that conversation is, it's just not check the box. You've done these things. It's also performance-based, obviously. But then we've also taken it a step further and we've broken down the jobs individually to say, these are the things that you need to do to move up within the job. Because the first question that any early career individuals, what do I need to do to get to the next role? And if we don't prepare the managers and supervisors with the appropriate education materials to do that, they're going to struggle to have that conversation. Then, which ultimately reflects back to the employee of, they don't know what it is. How's that going to help me? So by doing that, we've really addressed a big concern. To Tom's point, retention is going to be a critical issue moving forward. I think most organizations that are going to start to lose folks. You just want to make sure that you've done everything that you can do to retain them. Ultimately, you're always going to lose some. But if you do what you think is necessary from an organizational standpoint, as well as from a culture standpoint, I think those employees who value the mutual insurance organizations, they'll stay. And those are the ones that you do want to. But to Tom's point, we are seeing an increase, speed up in retirements. My concern with that is, have we done a good job of getting that knowledge transfer from those individuals? Because these are folks with 20, 25, 30 years worth of insurance experience that are going to walk out the door with kind of all the skeletons in the closet, right? My big fear, especially in the IT side of the house, is I have one of my higher end IT folks, they know all the back end homemade systems. So they leave, that talent gap is gone from a knowledge base. So that's the one thing that we've been really stressing the past 2 years now because of COVID is, who are those individuals? How do we get that information out? And part of it's challenging those individuals, because that's a scary thing for those individuals, is giving up all the knowledge they have. But it's really spinning it of, hey, you're now passing along the information that's going to be able to really allow the organization to continue to thrive and grow based on all the work that you've done to this point.
How about when you're talking about the employees and engaging in how they're feeling and their, what their needs are? Since you both are in HR, have you reached out with surveys? Have you used your managers to get the feedback? Can you talk a little bit about what their needs were, perhaps in the beginning, in the middle, and now when we're going forward? Share some of those thoughts that you've seen.
Yeah, throughout, obviously through the past 2 years, we were doing pulse surveys, especially on the front end, all of 20. And that was more every other month or so, kind of really making sure everybody was doing okay and that level. And we've continued that. We wanted feedback from employees as we started to think about what it looked like to return to the office. Got to be careful with that, because you don't want to make promises, but we also wanted to get input from the employees to say, hey, what do you think works the best for you? And take a look at that and take that in consideration. And the last thing that we really did was we actually did a full-blown employee engagement survey through a third-party vendor that provided a lot more information beyond those just pulse surveys. So we looked at it more organizationally based and got some really good insight in terms of, hey, our employees are engaged, but there are some things that we need to continue to look at a department level, at a structure level. So that information was invaluable to us to making determinations. And as Tom talked about, everything that we did in terms of about coming back to the office, everything that we stressed first and foremost was employee safety. So we've always lined that up in terms of anything that we did. And even with the surveys, it was based on what we want to do to make sure that you return to the office in a safe manner, whatever that may look like.
Yeah.
Are you taking questions?
We are, yes.
Okay.
Sorry, Tom.
So I have a question. Hold on, I guess I got it.
Is it working now? Okay, so I do have a question, since we're talking about retention, and for somebody like me that has to set up budgets and all this other kind of stuff, are you seeing a new complicating factor among your employees dealing with, okay, we thought this inflationary trend was going to be transient. It doesn't look like it's going to be transient, and we're all paying $5 a gallon or close to it for gas. What are you seeing within your companies and the pressure from your employees as you're thinking about coming back into the office? And what are some of the potential solutions that you may have come up with to deal with that, because once again, it's an irritant for lots of folks, and this could be the straw that breaks that camel's back, and says, I'm going to leave now because there's a better option for me.
As we've looked at the return to office or return to working together in person, not even, per se days in the office, there's a lot going on at this period. So I don't know that we've looked at just one thing at a time. So we looked at, again, the retention around the hot jobs, what's going on in the market, and the engagement of key individuals. So there's the monetary pieces that go along with that. As we look at the social factors outside the organization of bringing folks back together, we're focusing right now on the meaningful moments, as Patrick was highlighting. What's the value of leaving your kitchen table to do the work in your office? If it's to sit in a cube to do the exact same thing all by yourself as you're doing a kitchen table, there's no value there. So we're not pushing for that. But what's the value of the collaborative moment? When we're just now starting to have conversations at the management team level around this notion of the cost of inflation and the burden for commuting back to an office where folks used to not even think about the price of gas because it was commuting to work. The other side of that is look at all the things that folks saved throughout the 2 years of not commuting, right? So, life goes in ebbs and flows, and which of those are company responsibility versus which of those are just cost of living. And so we have not yet tackled any issues around inflation is the reason to not come to the office, or inflation is the reason to throw yet more money towards a solution. But what is the aggregating set of solutions that are cultural, that are engaging, that are collaborating, such that folks continue to want to come back together in new and different ways. That's not to say, however, if inflation keeps going, that becomes a compensation, benefits, finance, payroll mix element. I don't think today, though, it relates to retention. What it does relate to is the need for flexibility for those, particularly on the lower wage scales. Why would we insist that they drive into an office 5 days a week if they have a 45-minute commute? It equates to 20% of their paycheck in gas, right? So, we have to be really smart about that, but we're not looking at any cost of living answers to retention, if you will.
Yeah, very similar. It's really looking at what makes the most sense. So hindsight, not coming back to the office 5 days a week, that would be a hard sell, especially, obviously we weren't expecting a conflict in Europe
right.
We knew inflation was coming. We weren't expecting the other piece.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be that management at all levels, having discussions, having a better understanding of what the employees are feeling. And as Tom said, do we have to do something different? If this, if we see $5, $6, what does that look like for our employees? And okay, maybe we, if it's not something, you're driving 45 minutes to an hour, why are you doing that? And just have that common sense conversation. Or if an employee comes and be like, I'm struggling with this because of this, be able to engage, have that discussion, make the sound decision of what makes best for both the company and the employee. But holistically, if this continues for 6 months, then we're going to have to start having more lengthier discussions around what do we need to do from any sort of comp, benefit, total reward standpoint to offset the inflation, everything else.
Yeah. And we're fortunate that we have a very open employee feedback culture. Our employees will let us know if it's becoming a hardship in any way, and we'll respond accordingly to what we learn.
For those folks in the audience, if you do have questions, obviously raise your hand or stand up, because it is kind of a hard room to see everybody here. But I would also ask Tim, as the moderator, to repeat the question, because we do have some folks live.
Sure.
Online too.
Okay. So other questions?
Yes.
Evelyn. Hold on a second.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned that creating meaningful moments when you're bringing folks in, trying to figure out how it's not just them sitting at their desk doing their job. How do you balance that with the need for individual flexibility around them deciding the days they want to be in the office that work best for their schedule?
Yeah. So when it comes to meaningful moments or defining meaningful moments, we started before the Omicron variant came on the scene. We had a protocol and a method how we were going to bring folks back in January. And that included team days. So that each department or each division coming up with what's the right day for everyone to be in the office together. And that might then be the day that you do your staff meetings, for example. We've already migrated away from that to say, all right, so the key about that was making sure you can get back to in-person staff meetings. So the staff meeting itself is the meaningful moment therefore, what's the right way to do staff meeting? Somebody may still have the same family challenges on the day of staff meeting. So staff meeting might be 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock with a staff lunch and then go back home, right? So it's no longer about hours in the office. It's about the moments we work in face to face. And so it could very likely be that it's a 3-hour day and then back home on your emails, or a full day of training for new hires learning the technical skills of their job. There may be requirements for that individual to have to be in a training scenario on site for a full day. So that would be role specific. So it's about the moments, not the brick and mortar and not the fixed hours of a day any longer.
Yeah, echo that. It's managing the work, not managing the schedule. And it's a pretty big dynamic shift from 4 or 5 years ago. The other thing, corporately, it sounds kind of simple, but we're using Teams technology. So for any sort of corporate event, we're planning it out already. And we've actually put together a Teams calendar that all the company can see that will actually highlight what those corporate days will be and what those events are. So we have what we call HMIG Academy sessions. It's an opportunity for an hour for each department to talk about what they do, especially as we introduce new individuals to the insurance industry. That's kind of critical. Underwriter doesn't know what a claims person does. So we have those planned out. We have Employee Appreciation Day planned out. So all that is out there. And we've now alerted the employees of, hey, the calendar's built out. Please go reference that so you can plan accordingly as much as you can. Again, providing as much information and flexibility. So it's better to do it that way versus, hey, next week we're going to have this.
Mhm.
Again, it's thinking a little bit more forward, being a little bit more deliberate in what you want to schedule and how you want to go about it. That provides hopefully a little more flexibility for employees to figure out how that works with their schedules. But the encouragement is these corporate events are an opportunity to connect, have a meaningful moment with just not your team, but with the organization as a whole.
Great.
Yep.
Other questions? I had a few other items. Okay. The one is about everyone's interested in what positions look like now and look in the future. So as you know, with all companies, you have operations, IT, claims, underwriting, et cetera. Have you looked at those job descriptions, for lack of a better word, and can you give us some insight on maybe how you see those evolving, by category? Because we know some people have to be on site more than others. So I think everyone would be interested in some of your feedback about how you think this is going to go as far as actual different job duties.
On our end, what I've really tried to do is challenge the leadership team not to look at people, but to look at positions. And does that position need to be in the office? We always have the tendency to go to the person, but you really got to look at it from a position level to say, hey, does that? So I always use the example of a development, IT developer. 9 times out of 10, they don't need to be in the office. They're probably better suited sitting at home, cranking out what they need to get done. And then again, going back to those meaningful moments, bring them in when that makes sense from a collaboration standpoint. We haven't delved so far down the road where we think jobs are dramatically going to change from a role and responsibility standpoint. I think what will change is how those jobs are done and potentially where those jobs are done. The one silver lining of everything that has occurred is while recruiting is very hard right now, the fact that we can go outside of where our brick and mortar are opens up the talent pool even more than what we had 3 years ago. 9 times out of 10, we would focus on people within a radius of an office. Now we don't have to. You can have somebody working in a different state that gets that job done. Again, it's going back to that, does that job need to be in the office or is it something that can be done remotely? It opens up that applicant pool.
Yeah, and I would add that, when it comes to looking at the individual roles, whether it be claims, underwriting, or some of the corporate staff functions, for example, looking at the work and when does that work benefit or bring best value by working with others in person? That's really the new lens we're bringing into the organization. Another lens I think we all need to be ready for is, when you look at the shifting talent availability, even if we can reach more broadly now into other geographies by having remote workers, there's this, what I think might be next is the notion of building versus buying, right? So if underwriters are hot right now, how do you build underwriters if you can't just go buy one? There are lots of organizations driving up the price for underwriters, that doesn't mean that that's going to be a sustainable market level for that job. I think that's a reaction to the pendulum swing that's going on right now. So in addition to buying or competing for underwriters in the marketplace, what are the competencies required to be a really good underwriter? How do you find the competencies in other folks, other roles, other places in the market, and then build your underwriters from folks coming into your organization with really strong competencies? So the shift of the job description that we're going through is we've incorporated the competency models into the job descriptions, which then informs the job posting in a very new and different way. So now we're posting to the market looking for, let's say, an underwriter and others who might be interested with these qualifications. And then we'll bring them into our way of doing underwriting. If we can get a full-fledged, highly qualified underwriter, yes, we're not putting that on the shelf, but it's that and what's the next and version of that as we look at where do we have to build versus just expect to be able to buy a talent.
Let's assume that everything keeps going. Oh, go ahead. Oh, hold on. So get the mic first. Question in the audience.
Is delayed. I have a question about what you're seeing about the generation in the middle, right? Because over the last few years, we've been focusing on getting new talent in because, the silver generation is looking for retirement. What do we find about retention of your managers and that group in the middle?
So the question is about how to retain middle market or middle managers in the workplace.
I think it's interesting. So the middle of the organization, whether it be middle organizationally or middle generationally, that's the sweet spot, right? They are the next knowledge holders. They are the wisdom keepers. And what I'm hearing anecdotally in our organization is folks who thought they were going to catch into the retirement wave, but they still have another 10 years of energy left in them. They're recognizing with the silver generation leaving at an accelerated rate, they now have opportunity. So there's opportunity for everybody in the organization by virtue of the turnover. We've never had turnover to the degree we've had the last 2 years. So we're actually in our organization fortunate because it reawakens careers for others that may have felt otherwise, kind of locked where they were. At the same time, though, we have to, again, make sure that we're not only looking at the newer, younger generations as it relates to career development, professional engagement, because, the mantra that I bring into the organization all the time is we are a 5-generation workforce now. And so how do we do care and feeding, care and well-being for all 5 generations? Even as our retirees are going out the door, there are many that we're starting to say, these could be future alumni, future mentors, future faculty for training. So how do we not write folks that don't write anybody off? Don't write off a middle manager who appears to be approaching retirement age, and don't write off anybody that is actually retiring. And so I think it's that whole systemic. If you think of your organization as an ecosystem, everybody has a critical role to play, and what are the other roles they may wish to play, and then how do we help map them in and out of those places?
The one thing that we've seen is similar is they're looking for opportunity, just as the early career people are. So what's next for me? What are those opportunities? So my challenge to the senior leadership team is, and this is by nature, high level, they end up doing a lot of the work. Well, the question is, what work can we push down that provides those opportunities, provides that enrichment? And they're like, wow, hey, I'm getting in some stuff that I normally wouldn't, or I have not been exposed to, broadens their abilities, and also prepares us from a succession planning standpoint, because they're actually brought into the loop in terms of what we're doing and getting them ready for those future leadership opportunities. Even if they are a current leader, maybe they're that next leader 1 or 2 levels up. So just because we provide opportunities down low doesn't mean we can't do that in the middle area of the organization as well. It's just thinking about how we get that work spread out. We have the tendency to hold stuff. We got to kind of let that go a little bit, push things down, give opportunity. By chance doing that, other individuals get more opportunity to do different things.
Some of this may sound conceptual, so let me give you a tangible example of another way that we get at this. Within the HR department, we look at what are the unintentional consequences or the unintended bureaucracies, right? So how do you make sure that you're enabling all this movement of folks or the dissatisfaction of folks through the policies you have? If you're expecting folks to be more agile and more flexible throughout an organization, to go laterally and develop new skills or bring their skills to a new division where they have a more burning need, how do you make sure your compensation policy doesn't hurt them? We had found, about maybe 3 years ago or so, that folks who wanted to take on new opportunities, we're going to lose money in doing so because the policy says, right? So you have to really also open up your policies and make sure that there's flexibility within your infrastructure that matches the flexibility expected in your operation. And so that's a new and different behavioral piece as well.
Looking outside the industry, there are other places that you look to that can help the insurance industry, you know, in your research and whatnot?
I like to look at healthcare a lot because I come from a pharmaceuticals industry background and healthcare, and I also come from a large consulting firm's background. And in pharmaceuticals and healthcare, there are very similar rigors around regulatory and compliance pressures. So I'm always mindful of the burden of shifting too quickly when you have regulations that you have to also be mindful of. The staffing models in healthcare are similar in terms of if you can't be optimized, if you can't have all the extra headcount you wish you could have because the marketplace is so competitive, you know, what's working in an HR division or what's working within an IT division in some other industries that are really tight margins. I'll also look at consumer packaged goods because they operate on a 2% margin. And how does a consumer packaged goods organization flourish in these times if they have only a 2% profit margin? And we are doing all quite well, you know, many of us doing quite well the last couple of years. So what's our stumbling block? It's not financial, right? Is it leadership? Is it managerial? Is it operational? Is it policy bureaucracies? So really to benchmark outside of ourselves. One of the things that I learned in pharmaceuticals, the industry is very similar to insurance in that a lot of the industry centric conferencing, just like this, but we became so incestuous. We were all chasing each other's programs, policies, and frameworks that it all starts to look like one company after a while. So it is important to look out. I think it's very important to look outside the industry as well.
Yeah, similar. I came from a banking background, so I even though finance and banking or insurance are always tied together, the banking model is very different in a lot of circumstances, but very similar in terms of constraints, running lean. So I always look at the banking side, you know, been lucky enough to network with some of those individuals, have a better understanding of how they're handling things. And that I have a consulting background as well. So going to those organizations that are looking at a billable process, while we're not billable, how they structure and maintain and retain cost helps us be able to provide what we need to do. You know, I think the biggest thing that most companies still struggle with is how do you staff? How do you staff out 3 to 5 years? You do your best, but by taking some information from different organizations, you can kind of get a better idea of how they model their staffing plans based on their business, and you implement that into what you're doing from an organizational standpoint.
What if we're counting on everything sort of returning to normal? What's your playbook if we actually have another Delta variant or something come up? I'm sure in your committees you already have that anticipated. Can you share with us what you're going to do if another variant happens, like in a couple months or next year?
The $1 million question. Unfortunately, this is going to continue the next couple years. The benefit of working and looking at different organizations in different areas that the healthcare industry and the pharmaceutical industry are really focusing on, this being the next 3 to 5 years. You know, we've gone from pandemic to endemic. So this now turns into the flu. So do I think, without knowing what the next variant will be, the advances I believe that has occurred already, as well as what's going to happen in the future, makes this a little bit more manageable than it was when this first happened. But I think what we'll always do, as we have done, and I'm sure Tom has done, we're going to follow CDC guidelines. You know, if the CDC comes out or state and local come out and say, hey, these are the things that you need to do, we're always going to take those into consideration first, because ultimately it goes back to the employee safety. We can't, fear is always going to be there. The flu season is right around the corner. Once we get through this summer, flu season is going to happen. So we've actually told employees as we reopen the doors, if you're not feeling good, sniffle, cold, cough, stay home. So I think that will become a little bit more of the norm. But again, we're going to follow if it's, if we get another Omicron type variant or something to that degree, we're going to have to follow the guidance of the experts that tell us what we really need to do and what we need to know and how we handle that.
Yeah. And I would add another layer to this. The pandemic was an experience that disrupted us into this new way. This new way, though, to the question about the playbook, the new way now is about, in my mind, business continuity and organizational agility. It could be a hurricane. It could be a tornado that knocks down your building. It could be anything, or it could just be next year's flu season that shows with dramatic symptoms. So for me, it's the playbook is your business continuity plan as experienced through the pandemic, as tested through the pandemic? And then what's the organizational agility that we're now learning and operationalizing, such that when the next thing happens, it may not be the next virus, it may just be the next life thing that happens for us. We'll have a plan. The plan is think back to this experience, think back to business continuity. What's the agility with which we now operate? The technology has advanced to enable all of this stuff to be done differently. So there's even less of a scrambling for whatever could surprise us next. We'll scramble even less than we did for this one. So, we can actually feel good about where we've come through all this, because it's now life skill kind of a thing rather than a process or operating procedural element.
About the whole idea of time away from work. You're getting requests from the new recruits about unlimited time off, but maybe tell us about how you've evolved about when many of us came in the industry, it was so many sick days, so many vacation days, so many personal days, and it got a little crazy, especially when you wanted to be sick on a Friday 2 weeks from now. It's amazing how you can predict that. And our management teams didn't really like that. And so maybe comment a little bit about how we're evolving on this time off, because to me that it's become a little foggy and now it's become maybe a little easier.
Sure. It's interesting. Anecdotally, we hear folks are having trouble taking the time off that they're already entitled to. So there's a little bit, I'm always skeptical of what's in all the white papers, because, white papers are written by many folks, coming from the consulting world. Many of these white papers are written by folks who have never run a business or have never been the client. So I always, react differently to some of the white papers, but organizations that I've checked in with who have this unlimited time off policy, they typically allow it for their leadership, because those are the folks who are working the 24/7 and they need to be able to do the ebb and flow with their families and with their job accountabilities. But by and large, every person that I've talked to in probably 7 different organizations, they're not able to use the additional benefit of the unlimited time off. They're still struggling with being able to take the time off that was in the traditional plan of, X number of weeks based on X number of seniority. And in our organization, our employees, we limit the accruals so that they don't feel like they're falling behind, because some folks were feeling defeated by not being able to take all that was kept carrying over. So we've actually limited some accruals, and we have that CPTO, combined bank of time off, that we're finding as we talk with employees, it's actually helping them use their time because they know that it's bucketed for them to use. During the pandemic, however, there was such liberalization of how to use your time. There was an awful lot of folks not claiming time off. And we recognize that because there was pandemic time, there's vaccination reimbursement time, there's all these other qualifiers. But now that we move out of pandemic, that liberalization, we're planning to pull it back and go right back to policy, if you will, policy programs.
So we actually rolled out unlimited PTO for our management team in 2021 as a kind of a pilot program. We wanted to see how it worked. I'm assuming Steve Linkus must have sent you that email, because Steve is the one who's pressuring me to do this for all of our organization. But so, not to go too deep into the psychology, and the white papers speak a lot about this. When you go to an unlimited PTO, what do you think happens? People take less time, right? Because there's not that number there that I got to take that. So I ran the numbers. All of our managers and supervisors holistically took less time. So it's not a benefit for employees. Ultimately, it's a benefit for the organization. You get that liability off your books for any sort of payout. Then you add the complexity of whatever state you live in, because there's state regulations in terms of what time you have to offer. There's record keeping requirements. So for Maryland, I have to do unlimited PTO for our managers and supervisors. They still have to request the time through our system. It's got to be approved. So what's the difference between unlimited versus the time they have? We flip it though, to Tom's point, the way we work has totally changed. This goes back to managing schedule versus managing work. Right. If the person's getting their job done, how much, or should I be so concerned about how much time they're taking? That's a conversation organizationally that you really need to muddle through to kind of figure out what that works. A lot of companies have done it. Some companies have pulled it back. That's why I've kind of done it from a pilot program, and we're going through that menagerie of what do we do? And then you add the complexity of, it's pretty easy for exempt employees, your salary, because they're getting paid no matter what. It's a little bit more complicated with your hourly folks and the regulations associated with that. So it's not as easy as an answer as you would like it to be. I would love to be able to say, hey, take as much time as you need, but are our managers and supervisors prepared to be able to say, no, you can't take that time because we have this going on, and that also goes back to, have we built in from a staffing standpoint to make sure that we have taken into account and making sure we got staffing. So we rolled out a maternity and paternity program in 2020, pretty generous program. We didn't account for 4 people in our claims office having kids
At the same time.
at the same time. Needless to say, my VP of claims was not happy that we rolled that benefit out that year. But it made us think a little bit differently of, okay, from a staffing standpoint, as much as we want to run lean, where does that bench flexibility come in, where we have folks who can swoop in, help out, become that extra help. So again, it becomes more business decision in terms of how do you manage that. Where it will go, I don't know. I know where my president wants it to go, so we'll work towards that one way or another.
And for those of you who may be considering this, a piece of that consideration is what's your organizational culture?
Right.
What do you expect of your folks? Do you expect them on a clock? Then you can have finite benefit parameters too. But if it's do whatever it takes and we'll give you whatever you need, that's a different framework against which you design programs. So it all depends on how empowered versus how structured your organizations will be.
Here's an idea that comes to mind. At Beasley, when I joined them, I was surprised that after 10 years, you get 3 months off. It's like a sabbatical, like you're a college professor. I've never heard of it before at all. And it's interesting, like when the people take their 3 months off, some do early retirement, which is hilarious, right? Because they actually figured out that they don't want to work anymore. So the management team, I think, is sort of wondering about that piece, but they do seem refreshed for those who have to keep working. They do seem refreshed. So I wondered, again, thinking out of the box, I step back and say, why can't our industry think about things like that? So in other words, you got someone that's there 10 years. I would probably argue that a 5-year reset isn't a bad idea, especially for the management team that are working the 24/7. In other words, a time to step away, and you're not allowed to, by the way, have your connection at all. That's part of the requirement. You must give up your job for the 3 months. So no one can contact you and they want you to rest. So I wondered if, again, looking outside the industry, what do you think of that idea? I mean, I just think it has a lot of positives to it.
Many organizations, especially in the technology side of the house, do that. Obviously, education has been doing that for decades. How many of you would put away your technology for 3 months? From a work standpoint, that'd be pretty tough.
Yeah.
But that's the whole purpose of the benefit. So it would also be retraining the thought process and also making sure that you have people set up to be able to, hey, this person's going to be out for 3 months. Who's picking up that work? It may provide opportunities for other individuals, but it would be a challenge for some individuals to take that 3 months.
Well, it is. In fact, there's all these rules about it. So you have to give a 1 year notice of when you want to put it in.
Yeah.
And then from that time, you're trying to get people to come in and service, in our case, the brokers or whatever role you're in. So it's sort of like your unlimited PTO.
Right.
It's there, and you don't have to take it in year 10. Let's say you're hitting a really busy year. You can take it in year 11 or 15. But then if you're there for 20 years, you do get 2, you just can't take them. They have so many years apart.
I just wouldn't be fearful of looking at things differently. From an insurance standpoint, we're competing for talent across the board, just not insurance professionals. So if you think differently, it fits your culture, you have those discussions at a high level, it makes the most sense. Why not take a look at it and make sure it's something that maybe will add value to your organization, not just for the folks that are there, but maybe the folks who want to come there.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to have those discussions, look at it. Like I said, we ran the Unlimited as a pilot program to see how it worked, kind of prove out what I thought would probably happen. But it doesn't mean that we won't still look at it further down the road for the rest of the employees. So thinking outside the box, be critical moving forward, just from a standpoint of retaining in recruiting new talent and making sure that you're providing the best opportunities for your employees.
Yeah, Tim, you asked the question, why don't we think out of, as an industry, why don't we think out of the box? I guess my simplifying answer would be if we don't think out of the box now, when will we? Right? I mean, it's unavoidable. I mean, we're doing it now. Even having this discussion is an out of the box kind of a discussion because there's so much gray zone in it and so much ambiguity as you navigate through this.
Any other questions? Because we started early, we'll wrap up early. Go ahead, go ahead. Hold on, microphone. Joanne?
I'm just wondering, so when people come back from the 3-month sabbatical, sort of caught on that one. What's the transition? How do you get those people back in the flow and how long does it take them to get back up to speed?
So the question is for people virtually is, when people take a 3-month sabbatical, how long does it take them to get back up to speed and how do you get them back into their, track? I guess is a question, right, Joanne? So it's interesting, one of the gentlemen, he was handling complex claims. I think the claim settlements began at $1 million, a really key employee. And I think we all can agree that's sort of difficult, but he had his time and he put in, he did all the rules. And so they actually, just start looking at different offices of his peers. And there was a group of, I think like 6 people that did that from around the world. So we're lucky because we're a global organization. And so they just sort of split his case settlement up. So it was sort of a winding down, so almost like you were going into retirement, if you will. And then when he came back online, they take that caseload and they just would give it back to him. So some of these examples are easier than others. I mean, if you're in IT, you can imagine how difficult that is with trying to get a program launched, right? So that's where some of the flexibility comes in. And for example, if you need to be there another month, or something, I'm sure there's ways that, you as the person that has the time off could say, hey, I can't go right now. I need another month. And they'll work with you on that. It's not that rigid, but sometimes it's hard because like my boss, he did it about 2 years ago and he did this thing, he's in London and he did this like reverse around the world trip type of thing. So he goes, you can buy a certain pass on the airlines, especially in Europe, like British Airways. And as long as you stay on a route, you get this pass for your whole family. And he went over to Australia, then he went to California. And I said, I don't want to hear anymore. I don't really care where you went, getting around with them. He ended up going to British Columbia and things like that. And he literally was offline, for the 3 months. So in his case, I think it was his boss that sort of stepped in, and then we had another focus leader, as we call them, step in for like to answer what I needed, or if you had referrals and things like that were out of the ordinary. So there's ways to do it, but it's like anything else. Our industry's sort of scared, I think, to try some of these things. And to my knowledge, we're the only company that's doing that. And when I joined there, and I said that should be the norm, so that's why I'm spreading the word. I'm giving away one of our HR marketing tools. By the way, we do pay for lunch when you come in. That's another item. And we have a ping pong table in Philadelphia. I want you to know that. So we've had that. I'm trying to figure out what the next best thing. We have espresso and we have some other stuff that's there, but everyone's trying to use the gizmos from the culture to say, hey, let's get our culture back. We have these fun activities to do. But if you want more information on the sabbatical, I'd be happy to share. But I thought maybe someone else out there had heard of that before. It was brand new to me.
Yeah, not in the insurance field.
Okay. Well, let's, do we have another question? Terrific. Hold on, microphone. For those virtually, we have another question.
Yes, my question is along the lines of the folks that have either retired or are close to retirement. Some of the trends that I'm seeing in other industries is they're bringing them back on as consultants or contractors to either, number one, fulfill the responsibility that was needed, the void that was left, or to train newer employees so that you don't lose that business continuity gap. I just wanted to hear, especially since the both of you have a consulting background,
right,
your thoughts on that. As we look at this particular industry, how do we when do we realize, hey, maybe we don't need an employee, maybe we could just do this with a contractor and run a little bit leaner.
So virtually the question is about retirees, and when they retire, can you bring them back as sort of a contract to train others or use them in other capacities?
So twofold with that. So that goes back to cost structure, right? Bringing contractors on, depending on what you can negotiate, may be more expensive. The 9 times out of 10, they're driving their own rate. Benefit wise, also, if a person retires and they're tied to a pension, they can't work because that affects their pension. So if they're drawing, so if somebody retires, they have a pension, They come back and work part-time, their pension stops. They can't receive the pension until they're actually stopped working. It's usually part of the language within a pension plan. Obviously, if no pension plan, no big issue, but that's a pretty big piece for folks. If they have pensions, because they want to be able to start withdrawing on that aspect of it. But it goes back to a cost structure. If it makes sense for what your business model is, and you have maybe not the bandwidth to transfer that knowledge or have people learn that, you're starting to see it. You have more individuals coming back after retiring because they're facing financial situations like inflation that they weren't expecting. Some of them are also looking to continue medical benefits because obviously the cost of medical benefits is the biggest piece as part of your retirement. But ultimately that comes back to a business decision from my perspective.
Yeah, and I would want to caution those of you who are leaders in your business units, but may not know the HR side of your business. We have had examples in our organization where deals were made along those lines that we had to uncoil. Because it not only is it sometimes bad for the employee, but if you are the employer who has a pension plan, the IRS regs will nullify your plan for everybody. I mean, that's the worst case scenario. If you got audited and you're in violation of the IRS regs around your ERISA plans or any of your certain benefits, you're out of business. So HR bureaucrats would often, we would get fingers pointed at us from management saying, you just screwed up my staffing plan for the next 3 years. So-and-so was going to retire early and I was going to keep them on to do this or that. And we had to really explain, this was high risk. So you have to be very careful. Make sure you bring all your stakeholders into the conversation.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hold on a second. Microphone. Brittany's getting used to running here now. Now we throw obstacles in her way.
So some of the challenge for some leaders is trusting their employees are being productive when they're not in the office. So I'm curious, did either of the organizations change the way you measure productivity through technology or other data?
So some of them are a little bit easier. Underwriter, you can kind of manage through looking at their desks. Same thing on the claims side of the house. Those are a little bit easier. And obviously if an agent's calling, this person's not getting back to me. Those are a little bit easier. It's the more so the support side is the one. We have not put any measures in from a technology standpoint. My IT group will always come to me and they're not fans of monitoring and the technology is not as good as it used to be. If you guys made me remember about 10 years ago when Yahoo was still Yahoo, they sent everybody home. Well, then they put in this nice little tool that would monitor when people were on and off. Well, that set a really bad tone with the employees. Because it goes back to that schedule versus work. But it's what we've engaged with the managers and supervisors is maybe instead of having monthly meetings, it's a weekly check-in, half hour, 15 minutes. What's going on? What are you working on? What do you need my help with? What do you got planned for next week? Where those things that aren't tangible that you can see either on a claims desk or an underwriting desk.
Yeah, I would say similarly. We're fortunate that we have a formalized performance management protocol. So within that, each year, you put your goals. What are the expected outcomes of that individual's work for that year? So we measure outcomes at intervals through the year. But operationally, as Patrick's highlighting, the thing that we've gotten better at now with remote working is huddles, not waiting for a staff meeting, but having huddles, having a 15-minute moment here, calling the right people together on a Zoom call for, issue resolution, et cetera. That doesn't replace the big meetings that we need to be doing in person going forward, but it does get those, pulse checks and the quick connections on things. So it's about the new communication methods, new communication frequencies, and a more casual approach in addition to the structured approach.
Yeah, I will add that this year I would probably say in 2020, our managers and supervisors were much more lenient. And rightfully so, given a lot of things that were going on, both professionally and personally for a lot of employees. My direction in 21 was, get it, we need to start to return a little bit more to normal, even though we're not in a normal work environment. So that performance management, we do quarterly check-ins. I went back to that. It's got to be more frequent. You just can't wait till the end of the quarter to review performance. It's engage. And through 21, we actually had to deal with some performance issues. And that goes back to when we start to go back to the office, working from home is a benefit. So if you're not performing, you're back in the office. Which ultimately means, guess who also is back in the office? The supervisor or manager.
Yeah.
And but that's the way it should be. But employees also need to understand, and this is the delicate aspect. If they're not performing, you need to be back in the office to the point where, because we want you to get better. That's the whole point of performance management.
Right.
It's not to work an employee out, it's to get an employee to stay, because it's a whole lot more cost effective to have them improve versus they have to go find someone else. But that also speaks to the culture of the organization. So I would say they have to be more diligent, to Tom's point, in being more interactive, managing the performance, have an understanding of what's going on versus waiting for those things to happen.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up. Believe it or not, it's almost 9:45 for the next session. So we'll just give a round of applause to Patrick and Tom. And Ron Gallagher is going to come up to introduce our next speaker. So we'll reset. Thank you very much. Okay, if everyone can take their seat, we'll start for the 11 o'clock session. And I'll turn it over to Kevin Finn, if that's okay. So Kevin, go ahead and do the kickoff. Thank you.
All right, good morning. Good morning. People take the cues. Great, we're excited to be here to close out the morning session. I think the first two sessions were outstanding. I think about just the talent challenges that are going on, and then cyber scares the heck out of a lot of us. But I think great sessions, love the engagement from the group. Right, and so really for this session, we want to make sure we continue that. The topic we're going to go through today, and we've got some marketplace experts to share their insight and their experience, what's worked, what has not, is really this idea around growing commercial lines. Right, and so we have the benefit, MCA, we only work with mutual companies. We get the benefit to see kind of what's going on in the industry. How are many of our clients thinking about the industry? And we hear a real consistent theme around, we want to continue to compete and be relevant in the personal line space, but there's this great opportunity in commercial lines. We're underrepresented, we want to grow. Maybe we're niched, we're really profitable, we want to grow. And just really this consistent theme. So I thought today would be fun to just share with the group some of the areas that in ways in which companies are building those capabilities to compete. And I'd ask again, the audience, share your experience again about what's worked, what's not. But before we go too deep, let me got the esteemed pleasure of bringing panelists up here to share their expertise as well. And so I'll turn it over to each one of them to introduce themselves, give a little bit of background. And so we'll start with Terry. Is that on? I think this.
So I am the current vice president of underwriting of Lidditz Mutual Group of Lidditz, Pennsylvania. We operate in 9 different states and are a mutual company that has been in operation for over 100 years. I have been in this business, in the insurance. Oh, I'm sorry. I have been in the insurance business for over 30 years and in various roles. So kind of started out my career in claims and moved on to an agency experience, and then went back to the mutual company operation, which I've been in the last more than 20 years. So I'm happy to be here. I also have only ever worked either in an agency or in a mutual company setting. I think it's just all about culture. I also reside in Lidditz, Pennsylvania. So happy to be here with you. Thank you.
Sorry, how about Kathy?
Hello. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here as well. Kathy Brennan. I am a senior VP and account exec at Berkeley Resolutions, which is a W.R. Berkeley company. I work out of the Philadelphia branch office. reside in Westchester. I've been with Berkeley for 19 years, almost 20 toward the end of this year, which has been quite the honor. And then prior to that, I started out in the business on the primary insurance side with Aetna, went through the Aetna Skills School training in Hartford, like many of you probably have done as well. I worked with AIG, bought a whole lot of reinsurance when I was with AIG, and decided to go to the reinsurance side at that time. So I went from AIG to Munich Re, a couple of other reinsurers along the way, and then ended up at Berkeley Re. And I reside in Westchester. I think I already said that. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Chris Airsman with Hartford Steam Boiler. I began my career there in 1988, so a little bit more boring, I guess, than the other two gals here. I'm currently a vice president, client company manager. And so part of my roles and responsibility is to cultivate, manage client company partner relationships. And make sure that everything runs smoothly, training and education and product awareness and all that with those client company partners. My territory right now includes Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, and it's going to soon expand. I currently live in Lehigh Valley area in Pennsylvania, and happy to be here. Thanks.
Bala?
Yeah, Bala Kumar. I'm co-founder of Jatos Technologies. We are based in Pittsburgh. For more than 15 years, we have been providing solutions in the core system space, policy admin, underwriting platforms, rating engine, those type of areas. Plus, lately, a lot of the digital solutions, whether it's the portals, mobile apps, coding, those type of things. Nice to be here.
Thanks. And last, Kevin Finn, President and CEO of MCA. So it's a company we started just over 2 years ago, November of 19, as I mentioned, just focusing strictly on the mutual space. Prior to that, I was with the Hartford with a T, for 15 years, the last 5 of which I ran their small commercial product management group. So that group was a group of about a couple hundred people. The business was about over $3 billion, and just saw this mass, just a dynamic marketplace in this commercial line space that just had a passion for. And so, excited to lead the conversation today. What we'll do is we'll go through just, kind of what are some of the key levers of success within the commercial line space. Kind of go through each one of those, and we've got experts to share their experiences on each one of them. And so maybe we'll just start with why is this an attractive marketplace? And so again, just think about the P&C marketplace being about $675 billion. You'll see here's the breakdown between auto and home, about 350, the commercial lines being 325. So roughly, half the marketplace. Just a reminder, from the NAMIC report, the mutuals write about 45% of the overall industry. And so again, you just think about where we're going to be focusing on is really around that $325 billion marketplace. Lots of different lines underneath there, businesses, those sorts of opportunities, but really very focused on that 325. Why do we see it as so interesting for many of our clients is now you think about just for the mutuals, their penetration by line of business. So a lot of mutuals historically starting in the personal line space, not surprising, right? Have about 60% of the personal auto space of that marketplace, about 52 of home. So over half of the marketplace is controlled by mutuals. You then go to the commercial line space. Right? Only a third of that $325 billion marketplace is now being written by mutuals. And so you think about this, that the growth opportunity that is in there is exceptional. And so thinking through, and many of the clients thinking, how do I write more of that? How do I get that 32 up to 45, 50%? And some of the attributes of the marketplace are really attractive. Right. So let me share a little bit. Right. So when we think about the commercial lines marketplace compared to personal, just think about in personal auto in particular, the top 10 carriers. So these major brands that are literally spending billions and billions and billions of dollars, right? The top 10 control 76% of the marketplace and growing. You think of kind of where that growth trajectory is going, you can see a day like that's going to continue to grow. Homeowners being about half is controlled by the top 10. You then go to the commercial line space, and roughly 35% is controlled by the top 10. So a lot of dispersion, a lot of different carriers out there who are participating in it. What you see here just on the right side is now you drill down to just small commercial. So small commercial is roughly 120 billion of that 325. You see this where there's no carrier that really has more than 5 or 6%. And so there's just a lot of opportunity and a lot of need for more and more markets to continue to compete in this place. It's not that we have to take something from the top 10 in personal auto. There's just a lot of different, there's room to grow in so many different places in here. There's not a predominant industry leader. There's enough for everyone. Another piece as we think about it is, why is this attractive for mutuals? And so there's a lot of press. When you talk about the headlines, I thought it was pretty funny about the white papers and how consultants write those to sell things. But a lot of press around the change in distribution. Right? That it's going more and more direct. That people want to buy direct. And so that's absolutely true in the personal auto space. Probably a little bit less so in the home. And then what you see here is really nascent in the commercial lines where there's a direct model. So the distribution is still almost 85% is coming through independent agents. Truly independent agents. You then see about 14.5% coming through captive agencies, and then a small component that's coming through the direct channel. I think that's going to grow, but it's coming from a really, really small piece. And I put on the side here is, I think, so we're now a small business, we've got to go and procure insurance. Thank goodness we have an agent. Right? The complexity, we'll get into a little bit about cyber. Like I'm glad I have an agent who's able to go out to the marketplace and really decipher what are the different coverages, where are the differences, what's appropriate for us and for our firm. And so I think that's going to continue to be a predominant channel for the distribution of commercial lines. And again, we think about the mutual strength and the independent agency channel. And so already having those relationships and being able to write more of that, again, lines up really well for kind of the marketplace opportunity that we see. And this is where we'll start to get into some of the different ways in which carriers are thinking about getting into the market, how they're creating differentiation, how they're finding opportunities for them to grow in what can be a very attractive marketplace. So thinking about all the different levers of the insurance value chain, distribution, product, underwriting, ease of doing business. We'll get into a little bit. Paolo will lead, I think, a fascinating conversation on that. We think about the digital experience, that no longer it's not acceptable that insurance is not an outlier in people's expectations of financial services. And so there's just an increased level of expectation there. There's some great capabilities that are now available. Obviously, on data and analytics, there's a tremendous amount of information that's now available, internal, first and third party, to be able to manage this business. And so it's really the totality of these capabilities kind of makes it fun for carriers to think about, how do I bring these together? Like, how do I create differentiation and grow from that 32% in the marketplace? So that's really going to be the kind of the setup for the conversation today. Like I said, we'll go through kind of some of the key value levers of success. And so we'll first start with is distribution. And so maybe Terry, at Lidditz, you think about this, it's a great opportunity because there isn't one dominant market, but that also means there's a lot of markets. And so how do you experience from Lidditz perspective in terms of how do you create awareness of your capabilities and what you want to write, and how do you differentiate from an independent agent perspective?
Yeah, so as you alluded to, Kevin, there's a lot of opportunity out there. A lot of large commercial carriers are realizing that now they want to get into this very attractive, smaller commercial capabilities and compete. So we have to be better. We have to do things that are different than those larger competitors and make a space for ourselves and gain more market share. So I think when we're talking about offering, we're really talking about a multifaceted term, right? I mean, offering to us, especially for a company that, with our culture being in business for over, 100 years, 100 and plus, many years, that we have developed, a culture around our offering. So it's not just about product and pricing, although that's like extremely important, because if we didn't have product and pricing, no one would come to us. So we have to advance that philosophy and that culture to a service mentality. So, I mean, often in our meetings, it's brought up, we are in business to service our policyholders. I think almost every meeting that's mentioned. So it's just our culture, and a lot of mutuals have the culture where, it's a personal touch. It's having a person available, responsive. It's having our underwriters, reach out to our agents and giving them that extra personal education, training, guiding them, and having that marketing rep, in their offices, having a system that's easy to use for a few minutes. Agents don't have a whole lot of time to spend. They're focused on sales. They're focused on their taking care of their customers, writing the business. So they don't have a whole lot of time to spend on systems. So that's, and getting the business written. So I think it's just a combination of all of those things that differentiates us in the industry and keeps us in the game and keeps us growing. But yeah, everybody is kind of in that space now, trying to vie for the same business. And that's how I think the mutual space and our company differentiates ourselves and provides that offering that's attractive to agents in particular, into our independent agency system.
So maybe, and also think about, so let us think of very, very well, the rich history known throughout Pennsylvania. I mean, you're now in 9 states.
Yeah,
So how do
known
you
throughout
think
several
about
states,
expanding
many
into those
states.
states, right? I mean, just how do you think about, you can't create a 30-year relationship in the first year, right?
Right.
Those long-held belief, like you've got those deep relationships in the state. As you think about expansion, like how do you figure out which agents to engage?
So, I mean, it's just a combination of knowing your partners, knowing your agents, getting to know your agents and building that relationship. I mean, everybody knows that we're in the business of relationships. So it's just, the distribution right now is changing so dramatically. It's not just the little mom and pops anymore. Like the mom and pops are kind of being aggregated or acquired by larger aggregators, which we then have to reach out and develop relationships with those folks. And it's not always easy because some of those aggregators have principals or owners in different states that we have to, it's not necessarily like, so we have the agency that we're normally dealing with in Pennsylvania. Well, now it's under the ownership of an aggregator that their headquarters is in New Jersey. So how do we get those people engaged and interested in writing, and directing for their folks to write, business with us? So we just have to make extra effort now. And it's not always, it's sometimes that's a positive thing to build, Bob, because you can see a new energy being brought to the table. You can see an interest in engaging in a new offering that they might not have had before. So we, can bring that because we kind of focus on certain types of smaller businesses. So, they're interested in that, but sometimes we have new players in the game. So they become comfortable with whoever they're writing business with. So we have to get in front of them and show them the benefit of writing with our company and continue that communication and building. So it's just a combination of our marketing department getting out there and in person as much as possible. It's been a little difficult over the last couple of years. But, just have to, a lot of Zoom calls, back in person is going to be important. Face-to-face communication is always important to build the relationships, and just showing, sometimes it just takes running through a system with people, showing them how easy it is to use, and then helping them manage through it to show, for them to see how easy it is to use as they're using the system. So it's really a combination of relationship and systems, product and pricing, and building that as the market changes so dramatically.
Thank you. Maybe before I move on from distribution, maybe just anyone in the group, I don't want to call on friends that I know have some of these challenges, but would be interested just as you think about the agency model and more acquisition, right? So whether it's a lot of PE money coming in. And so as Terry was mentioning, some of these large aggregators, any best practices, either, what's learned the hard way or benefits you're seeing that I think the group might benefit from sharing some of those experiences that the group would, anyone in the audience could share? All right, Bob, thank you.
I think he's doing voice, but we'll use it. I think ease of doing business is critical, and Terry mentioned making relationships with the principals, but I think making the relationships with the CSRs within the agencies is equally important, because what we have found is the producer will hand it to the CSR and say, go place it with X. And we have found that the CSR will place it with the path of least resistance. So if you're the path of least resistance, you'll get a better shot at running the business than if you're difficult to do business with.
Totally agree.
Anyone else kind of experience, especially expansion with some of the large aggregators from a distribution perspective? Yeah. Oh, I was looking for you. I thought you were over there, and I didn't want to call you, Andrew, but I appreciate it. Yeah. So just hold on one second for the mic.
I would just add that on the distribution side, I think is what the panel said and some of the audience, I think what you need to add to your best practices is the distribution pipeline of sales professionals. How many does an agency have? Are they active? What's their age? What's their plan for investing in the future? And how are they going to do that? I think putting more emphasis on those questions in today's world is more important than maybe 5-10 years ago, where that necessarily wasn't as big a challenge for independent agencies as it is today.
Thank you. All right, let's move to another key component of this is to be able to meet the needs in the commercial line space is having a broad product offer. It's the idea of being able to adjust and meet the needs of a commercial insured that can be really varied. We think even within small commercial, like what's a micro policy that's got 400, it's an at-home business versus a small manufacturer, like those risks are entirely different. And so ensuring that you've got a product offering to meet those needs becomes increasingly important. So spend a little bit of time, maybe I think, as companies think about growing and offering new product, one of the key decisions that they have to make right early on is, do I buy or build? Am I going to build this capability myself, or am I going to find a partner? And so maybe who do we line up on this one? Maybe Kathy and Chris will take this and just say, as you've seen carriers go through that initiation around like, what should we do? What we see a marketplace need, we think we want to fill this need, like we need to broaden our product. How do carriers effectively make that decision?
Sure.
Or some of the lessons learned about where they didn't make it well.
Right.
Yeah. So I think the answer is it varies a whole lot dependent upon the carrier. It depends on their carrier size. It depends on their product development staff. It depends on their internal resources, their IT infrastructure, what kind of a position they're in to be able to develop and implement a new product themselves. And it's not just about implementing that new product, it's about maintaining it and keeping it current in the marketplace. So oftentimes reinsurers have dedicated product people that have far greater resources especially on the latter end of the discussion, being able to keep the product up to date, knowing what's happening in the marketplace, being sort of the carrier's eyes and ears, and being able to get that product more quickly to market is also key. Because if a carrier makes a decision to do it themselves, it's typically going to be a much longer process to get it up and running and out to your agents quickly. So there's some different considerations, but I think for the most part, the smaller carriers just don't have all of the time and resources that reinsurers have. And that's the benefit of going to them and being able to get up and running more quickly.
Yep, Kathy, you hit it right on the head there. It's all about, of course, the time, the resources available to the smaller mutual companies, the expertise, the ever-changing legal landscape, and that company is comfortable with taking on that risk. Obviously, I was at least scared by the prior presentation, even though you said, we're not here to scare you. So how comfortable is that company taking on a potential CAT exposure, right? Whether it is something like a cyber, again, providing that legal expertise and keeping up with all of that.
I think, as a panel, as we were preparing, had a fun and I think interesting dialogue. Was another decision that carriers have to make is when you're expanding product, you make it opt-in or opt-out. And so if you're offering expansion, so maybe the panel could just maybe define what that means as you're thinking about product expansion, then maybe just some experiences, kind of what's worked and what's not. Maybe I think this would be interesting from both the reinsurance side as well as the carrier side and how agents take that.
I'll go ahead. Yeah, sure. So opt-in is where I think most people know at this point, it's the coverages. These bolt-on add-on coverages are automatically included with the option for them to be removed. Of course, that's tends to be the most successful way to put a product into the marketplace. You don't have that adverse selection, or so you get that spread of risk that I always tend to think you're gonna, as a company, spend time, money, resources, everything that we just talked about, and then you don't want to have that product just sit on the shelf. And so what good did that do for anyone? Some approaches that have worked successfully is if you, as a company, make it part of your overall filing package and include that rate in there. If you're able to do that, or if you're in that filing stage of, okay, well, I'm ready to introduce a new BOP program or whatever it is, and make those products all part of that overall program.
Maybe let's go to the other side, kind of let's argue the other side to say, well, if you include it in a really price competitive marketplace, okay, that's going to increase maybe sticker shock. And so maybe from a carrier agent, like how do they interpret or prefer opt-in versus opt-out?
Well, it's definitely easier whenever it's a coverage that is coveted, like if you are, continually getting requests for a certain coverage, like let's just say equipment breakdown as an example. I mean, almost every organization has a need for it. So it's not going to be, whenever you introduce it, it's going to be like, oh yes, finally, we're getting this additional protection. So I think there is a difference between, and most of the coverages that are introduced in an opt-out, kind of manner are coverages like, cyber. Everybody you hear it every day in the news. Everybody's looking for that coverage. Everybody is interested in having it. You just, have to still, continue to be competitive in your market for offering those coverages, but it's definitely easier whenever it's something that everybody is aware of and understands. Not that they totally understand, and that's our job to help educate them to the necessity of it, whether it be cyber, whether it be whatever the coverage that you're introducing, and then make sure to educate. And I think it's something that agents definitely, when you're in an opt-out approach, agents see the value in it because, you know, in our situation, we've had extremely high take-up rates on that, on the additional add-in coverages that we've provided. So, you know, obviously they do see, they can educate, they do see the benefit in it.
Yeah, just to add on to that, one of the carriers that we work with, they have opt-in for cyber and EPL. And so we have been looking at the trend or history of a period of time. But in the last year, pretty much everybody is going for cyber. So they are, you know, even if you say it's optional, they
Yeah, I think it's one of the things, so it's a little bit dated right now, but a few years ago, we'd look at who was actually buying cyber in the small space. And there was all these headlines around how everyone should, but the reality was only about 15% of the market was. And so that's increasing over time, obviously a lot more headlines, but there's this interesting dynamic around like, it's something that everyone needs, but the stats would say it wasn't something that everyone was buying, and the optionality of that. And so thinking about how you present your product, it sounds like, you know, with the opt-in or, you know, automatic coverage, there's a lot more, you know, take-up rate. And so that 15% is going to be going up. And so I think it's just an interesting, we had a really interesting, I thought, interesting conversation around kind of how people think about that and how they position it. So maybe I think there's probably just an interest, maybe Cappa, just given a cyber marketplace.
A cyber overview, now that we're
heard about
all
all this,
scared
the
of
scare,
everything we
right?
heard from Franco, CISSP. No, you know, everything that you said, Terry and Bella, you know, cyber is in demand. It's finally in demand, and it's in demand across the board from small businesses and large businesses alike. So, you know, the increased frequency and severity of losses has a big part of that. It's always in the headlines. You know, it's interesting because back when companies started offering cyber between 5 and 10 years ago in a big way, it was all about the data breaches, right? It was all about first party expense reimbursement. And that was the biggest cyber exposure at the time. So, you know, we classified different types of businesses by high hazard to low hazard. And it was all about their likelihood for a data breach. And cyber has evolved so much since that period in time, because now it's all about ransomware. And ransomware has affected the SME space so much more so than even 5 years ago. That's where they're headed. So like Franco had said, manufacturing operations are major targets, whereas before a manufacturing company would have very little cyber exposure from a data breach standpoint. So it's really changed a whole lot. FTF, funds transfer fraud, is another huge addition in the cyberspace that wasn't even on anyone's radar before. So, you know, that social engineering, that those phishing for getting payments made to the bad actor are huge today. So, you know, the cyber market has completely evolved, and, you know, it's all about education, as Terry said. It's about educating the agents on how they can sell the coverage, educating the agents. They don't probably need much to know that they need to protect their own E&O with coverages today that they weren't doing 5 years ago, they weren't selling. And it's a lot on them because there are so many different cyber coverage forms in the marketplace today, and they have to be aware and familiar of what their particular insured's exposures are and making sure that they're matching them up with a form that's going to provide them with the relief and with the loss payouts when they happen.
Thank you. You know, and so I think another area within commercial lines that's really exciting is as you think about product innovation. Innovation's on everyone's mind. Like, how do we continue to innovate in this space? And I think the product space is really interesting in that regard. And so maybe Kathy, you know, and Chris, if you could just share like some of the cool stuff you guys are working on. Right, this isn't a product pitch, right, or a sales pitch, but just thinking about like how is this continuing to emerge? How are you continuing to think about the product needs and innovation in the space?
Right. So, you know, innovation's all about how carriers can make themselves more valuable to their agents and insureds. And that's something that we've been focusing on and trying to come up with things that are happening in the world today where carriers can really help their insureds and show that they care, that they're thinking about how they can better protect them and help better manage even their risk control, their thought process, their company culture. So, you know, not to steal any thunder from this afternoon's talks, workplace violence is a perfect example. So everybody knows about the increasing frequency and severity of these horrible events that are happening across the country, both on a large scale basis and a small scale basis. You know, when you look at the impact of COVID mandates and how hostesses in restaurants and small business owners, airline attendants are getting assaulted because they're trying to enforce mandates. It's really a crazy thing, and it's affecting people's mental health. It's affecting their ability to want to go to work. And you know, we looked at the big picture, and workplace violence has been in the market for the very large companies for a long time. But we looked at how we could adapt that to smaller insureds. So worked with a bunch of carriers from across the country, listened to their needs, and developed a product that, you know, offers crisis management support, business interruption, site security services, mental health counseling, in the event that something happens in the workplace to the insured's employees. So, you know, it's a very relevant coverage in the marketplace today. It shows that carriers care and they're thinking about what their insureds are facing. And it's something you're going to hear a lot better stories on this afternoon.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk a little bit about the employment practices liability. That, of course, seems like that was a hot topic a while ago. Then cyber came in, and then listening to the gentleman speak this morning about all the challenges that we are all having with everyone coming back into work, and what all the companies are dealing with as people are coming back into the workplace environment. And so there was like a little bit of a, I guess I say we had a little bit of a scare with that initially, as we write the coverages and had that just an ask. We were always open for business of our partners, like, hey, if you get a request that someone's looking for $500,000 or $1 million limits, maybe you might want to ask a couple more questions about it. You know, why are they all of a sudden asking for these higher limits? So for us, we again, we're always open. And as far as the COVID, even though we've been in it now for 2 years, our feeling is that we haven't even reached the high point yet of litigation and claims coming in. Another interesting thing that we're keeping an eye on is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And there are 2 states right now, no surprise, California and New York, who have said that COVID is a disability. So the, you know, kind of what happens in California and New York might go everywhere else. And with the changes with the Americans with Disabilities Act, so that could be another potential increase. And again, the need for that type of coverage. And of course, when you talked about innovation at my company, my mind went right to sensor technology. So just another way of providing some value and another way to look at things in an underwriting world. So we have devices, or there's devices that are out there, of course, that can predict and prevent losses from happening. So that's some additional underwriting information for the mutual companies to maybe offer higher limits on spoilage or lower deductibles, things like that, because they have that device in place that's providing notification that they could potentially prevent a loss from occurring.
And also on the product innovation side, you know, on the commercial side, there is really no one size fits all. Even if you take a BOP, right? Some of our customers, they are offering like, you know, variation of that, a garage protector or a church protector. They're kind of niche for those particular areas. So those variations are one of the differentiators in the marketplace too.
let's keep clicking through some of these, right? So we went through distribution, some of the opportunities in that space. We talked about the need to continue to have a relevant and contemporary product offering, some of the innovation there. We'll skip over underwriting expertise, not because it's not important, but it tends to be a towering strength of the mutuals we're working with. And so it continues to be important, obviously, in the commercial line space. And so not that it's, I think really where it's really interesting is to dive into, and Bob, you had mentioned around the ease of doing business, right? So in this space, you know, historically has been a very labor intensive process. Like the idea of let's give a traditional, here's an application of, you know, hundreds of pages, there's 10 different documents we give you. You now need to go figure out, like, it's going to take 2 weeks to underwrite this risk and get back to us with what you want to do with it. That's just unacceptable now. Right? You will not write anything in commercial lines, especially in the smaller space, if that's the experience that you're going to have your agents going through. Right? The technology capabilities have increased expectations for the agents, and so this idea of ease of doing business is becoming more and more. I'd say it's foundational for success. It's not necessarily a huge differentiator. It's just an expectation of agents. And so maybe Bob, if you could just kind of paint the picture of like what technology is doing in this space and how you see carriers leveraging it effectively.
Sure. Yeah, as Bob said, agents are going to go for path of least resistance too, right? So the straight through processing is no longer nice to have differentiator. It is kind of core of doing business. You want to make sure as much as possible goes to the straight through processing. And on that front, kind of a lot of the data platforms are helping. Actually, Conver, Plank, and many of those people are providing data that you could use, right? And the other thing is, like, a lot of information is available in the social and other than the public domain. The underwriters, you don't want them to be spending, let me do a research project here, write a report, so they can end up spending a lot of time on that aspect. So these kind of data platforms are helping, and some of the mapping and other tools. You can look at the rooftops to really kind of judge the risk. So that is definitely helping. And in addition to straight through processing, the companies also need to look at some of the kind of insurtech type platforms, next to insurance pie, buckle and those kind of things. So you're not only looking at your peers close by, you also need to look at the marketplace of the insurtechs that's coming in. And the other thing is, sometimes even if you're not able to go through the straight through processing all the way, if you can shrink from 8 days to 2 days, that's a major advantage in terms of kind of making it easy for the agents.
And so this is this concept of ease of doing business straight through processing, right? Really, really important. But also carriers are in the business of making money, right? And making sure that there's still underwriting integrity around that process. It's great to be easy, but if you don't have the right controls in place, then it's going to be very difficult to be successful long term. So Terry, like, how do you think about that balance of, like, how do we balance ease with underwriting integrity?
Yeah, so I mean, over the last several years, I've always been asking agents, what's going to make your job easier? Because, and especially since the agency system has been changing so radically lately with all the M&A activity in the business. So I think, and we just continually, ask them. But what we found over the last couple of years is that they really don't have, when now they're kind of refocusing to more of a sales operation, more sales focused. So they want to make the sale, they want to get the business written, they want to move on to the next sale. They don't want companies to put a whole lot of work on their plates, so to speak. They want the companies to figure it out. They want the companies to understand the risk. They want to just put in the minimum amount of information. So it's important that we provide them with the tools that they need to to get the work done quicker. So when you're talking about entering a new piece of business, like maybe it's just a name and an address, we have the tools then that are readily available by many insurtechs now. It's like all over the place now. I constantly get emails from insurtechs asking for time to talk, so it's about putting those tools in place to allow them the ability to get through the quote quick, and then also having those tools available to assess the risk, the rooftop tools, things like that. So you don't have to be going back to the agent and continually asking questions, especially for smaller bot business. But I mean, that's just a part of ease of doing business. The other part is, again, making sure they understand the systems, making sure they understand the products, and coaching them along. And a lot of times, if it is exception underwriting that you're doing with your agents, having that person there that's willing, that wants to help, that cares about your business. I mean, there's a real, I think, burden in this industry today where some of the larger companies just don't even want to have the conversation. So not everything fits into a box. So, just having that person on the other end responsive to your need whenever you need to have those conversations is also ease of doing business.
How are we defining small commercial and straight versus needs underwriting?
Let's crowdsource the answer for where we are with straight through processing.
It does mean different things to different people.
So if I were to ask, where do we think the industry is in straight through processing? What percent of, let's say, less than $25,000 policies go straight through? Yep, what's your view? Just yell it out. No one's right, wrong. We're just gonna,
Yeah.
I wish we had like a polling mechanism.
We're 35%.
35, 40, 10.
You're saying across the industry.
I'm not qualifying. I'm just saying, what's the number?
Across the industry, I guess it's less than 10.
Less than 10.
But now you're talking small commercial.
Let's say, yeah, small commercial, less than $50,000. Because there's not a universal definition small. Right, so if we just draw the line and say some are gonna have exposure base, it's gonna vary, but we'll just use for these purposes, 50,000 in premium. So it sounds like somewhere 10 to 50, 40? Anyone think above 50?
10%.
Okay.
Lower probably. We're talking about how the business looks that way. It's probably.
Okay. If we were to look at large carriers' marketing activity, what would that look like? So if you look at their material, many of them are talking about 70, 80, 90%. And so part of this is just the challenge and the communication around it, because how people define straight through processing is all over the board. Right, again, not that we're right, but the way we would the way I would define straight through processing is if an agent goes into your system, they have an intent they want you to quote that piece of business. How many times can they bind it without an individual touching it? Again, not right or wrong. I mean, some will be, okay, we'll start capturing straight through processing is like once they go through a full quote and they've, passed all the underwriting questions, now that's going to be the denominator we're using. And so there's just a lot of differences around kind of how people are defining it. I think it's probably the industry probably is more realistically, if you kind of use that like top of the funnel down to the bottom, is probably in the teens. And just as we talk to a lot of clients about this, and so there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to continue. Then some industries are going to be higher than others. Right. So if you think probably more white collar, relatively an office exposure, relatively well defined, you're probably going to be over time. I think carriers will they'll get close to the 90. If you're going to be, our view again, if you think about construction risks, just a lot of differential between even in the small, what a contractor does. You're going to want an underwriter probably looking at long-term, at least 75% of those risks. Habitational could be similar. And so I think it really does, there's a lot of marketing here in terms of how carriers are talking about. It's about where they are I don't think there's a universal number, but I think most of what we see is, it's a journey that clients are on and kind of building those capabilities over time more and more to expand it. But my venture, I guess, is in the teens.
So again, it doesn't have to be 100%, right? If it goes through, it's great. But if it doesn't, if it defaults to like one of the carriers that we work with, what they do is, depending on the premium amount, potential premium amount, if it is not going to go through straight through, they are directly sending it to a specific underwriter. So they specialize in that, so they can kind of clear that application very quickly, right? So yes, it is defaulting away from the straight through processing, but they are able to do it in a day and get it out.
Right.
So that it's still value, even if you don't fully go 100%.
One of the interesting things that we experienced when we introduced this at my former employer was, and we didn't necessarily anticipate this, was the relationship between the underwriter and the agent changed. When you start introducing straight through processing, all those easy wins that you get to celebrate day in and day out go away. And so now it tends to be where your underwriter and your agents are talking about more challenging risks. And I feel like every day it's like, when do we get an easy win? Like, when do we get to celebrate that $1,500 BOP that just went through? We used to have to talk about it and give approval for it. Now I never see that as an underwriter. And so it's just an interesting piece as you start thinking about all the different components of this, is that that piece did, again, it was a miss early on, because it just did create a different type of relationship. And it actually allowed longer term the underwriters to spend more time on things that underwriters are really valuable at. Right. So instead of processing risks, they now got to really dig into some pretty cool risks that they got to use their expertise and their discipline on around finding solutions there. So I think it was a really cool kind of learning, and gave great job satisfaction to the underwriters, as well as helped improve the expense efficiency. So I think that the straight through processing, the technology, the ease of doing business continues. This is going to continue to make large investments across the board to meet those needs. But I think there's a lot of room based on just what we see to continue to improve. So we've got about 5 minutes left. Maybe open it up. Any questions?
Kevin, just curious, I've had a couple conversations here with folks, and there's definitely a lot of focus on business expansion, new products, acquiring new customers. But one thing I have not heard is about the renewals process. What is the typical percentage drop off of customers during the renewal process? And what are companies like yours doing to minimize that? Like, is there any innovation on that front? Just curious to retaining the business.
I would say, so one thing, I think one of the hallmarks of the mutual industry, it starts with a very high retention. Low 90s in the commercial lines is probably we see that often. Whereas in some of the larger, I'd say in publicly traded, is probably mid 80s. And so it's coming from a very good, like, people value the overall offering that mutuals are providing. And so you're starting from what I view as a very strong point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The retention is very high on the renewals. I think agents are paying more attention to servicing those renewals. They don't, higher premiums. They don't want to lose that. They normally do talk with the underwriter about, proposals for the renewals and negotiating that. Not all the time, but I mean, it does happen so that they can retain the business. I mean, that's basically what we all want, is to retain our business. That's where the profit, where we remain profitable. And, but yeah, it's, I think it's just a combination of, activity with those, staying engaged with that customer. But sometimes it can be because if we do lose, business, it can be because so many companies are vying for that business now. I mean, and they have such attractive, they're innovating, they're, especially the larger carriers who are just like moving quickly forward, more quickly than, the mutual space usually can move, because they have that much resource to do so. So if they are innovating and coming up with new products, then, sometimes that's attractive to the customers. And, but I would imagine they're getting about as bombarded as we are with InsurTechs, with other companies and agents coming in trying to take that business. It's a very active space.
I actually agree with that 90% type retention, which is great. And so in one example, they are not only looking at the STP, but they are also looking at, they call it as a renewal STP, renewal straight to processing. What they're doing is they have come up with 9 questions. And if, it's mostly yes or no type things. If, everything is no, they go for a renewal straight through processing. Nobody touches underwriters. And if there are any questions that are answered yes, and then underwriters look at it and see whether we need to ask for more additional information and stuff. So I think out of that 90%, they are looking at 80% of those going through renewal automatically. So.
Brittany, is that 3 questions or 3 minutes? All right. Anyone else? Questions, comments?
Yeah, we're the active group.
Yes, great.
I just had a kind of a comment, and then for you to comment on my comment is, are you seeing, some of the larger commercial carriers that also have very large books in the personal lines have an advantage? Because I think just from the technology standpoint, sometimes personal lines is a little bit further ahead, right? Because they're dealing with the consumer and different expectations, underwriting processes are different. And I think that's where we come into the challenge, especially, my company where, it's a very complex risk, but your company's already built the tech and is experienced with it. So then once it's, commercial space is kind of ready for some automation, you've kind of got half the battle done, right? It's already, and it's really just shifting it over into those underwriting practices. So just kind of creates, just a hunch of mine that kind of creates a little bit further challenge for us.
I can take that, or
Does that make sense?
yeah, right. So the idea of, I think, what you're seeing, and really where that kind of that bleed from, well, my view, kind of from personal lines, is really in the low end of small commercial. Right. So you're still getting, and again, there's no universal definition of small commercial, but once you get above $10,000 in premium, right, that tends to, that under 10, people really look at it as a portfolio. There's a ton of third-party data, so you're able to use the technology and the data from that personalized carriers have built and really just kind of move it into the small commercial. As you start getting up in size in the commercial space, it's a little less relevant, only because there isn't as much rich data on, let's say, a $50,000 risk that's available. There's still uniqueness around that risk where you're going to have an underwriter look at more of that. And so, yes, they're moving. They're using some of that. Some of them are more aggressive than others. Probably the industry leader in that space is Progressive. Right? They've got a $5 billion commercial auto book. Right, and they're taking that and they're bringing it into BOP and other lines as well. So they're probably of the large, like the large brands. What I see is moving most aggressively in the commercial. Well, excellent. I will get everyone to lunch right on time. Appreciate everyone's questions, engagement, and to the panel, thank you guys so much. I know this was the first panel for many of them, and I think you did a great job. So thank you so much.
Okay, if everyone can grab a seat, we'll continue with our 1 o'clock session. Title of the 1 o'clock session is Crisis Management for Workplace Incidents in Small Business. And we're lucky today to have 2 speakers that are very well versed in this area, and glad to have their expertise. And I'll let them introduce themselves, but I'll at least tell you their names. So we have Hart Brown and we have Harry Rulin. So I'll turn it over to you too. Hart, you want to start with your intro?
Of course. Thank you very much. And looking forward to the conversation today. I know both Harry and I are looking forward to it and open to conversation and questions as we go throughout the presentation. So if something does pop up or is of interest to you at the moment, please don't hesitate to stop us and ask the question as we go through. On background, about 25 years now in this general space, security and crisis management as it relates to insured types of events. Within that time frame, worked both with the U.S. government, about half of my time spent there, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Department of State, half of my time in the corporate sector working on issues that we're going to be talking about today, not just here in the United States, but in about 50 different countries around the world. So looking forward to the conversation today, and I'll turn it over to Harry.
Thanks. Hart and I have worked together quite extensively over the years. I am the CEO of Crisis Risk. We are an insurance program improvement firm. We use crisis and risk management in order to reduce frequency and severity in various insurance programs. We use it as a tool to assist in broker training and satisfaction, as well as insured retention and insured acquisition. So we're very much an insurance organization. I'm very happy to be surrounded. I wish I was there with you guys today, but I'm always happy to be surrounded by insurance people because I've spent my entire life in the insurance world. And like Hart just said, we would very much like to have a conversation, even though we're not in the room with you. So don't hesitate to interrupt us, during the presentation if you have any questions.
All right.
So go ahead. Go ahead with your piece then. Thanks, Hart.
Wonderful, thank you. So just some opening comments and
Art,
none
I'm
of
so
the
sorry. Can you please reshare your screen? We actually can't see it here in the room.
Interesting. Okay, I will stop and restart, but it is still showing that I was sharing. How about now?
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm glad that helped. As you can see on the screen, none of this is likely to surprise anybody, certainly in the room. When you look at this type of peril, this idea of workplace violence, the idea of shootings, anybody that watches the news on a daily basis now, given the past 2 weeks, have been highly biased towards what's going on in the Ukraine. And we're not seeing the same level of news coverage related to shootings, but they are still happening. And if you are following the news, you will see some of these types of shootings are still occurring. As you can see, at least one mass shooting a day, typically on a yearly basis. You can see the numbers on gun fatalities. You can see sort of some of the numbers on crisis responses to shooting events each year. All of these not only are significant numbers, but they're trending upward. Now, there's two different parts of this that I want to sort of leave you with as we enter this conversation, and Harry's going to take you into a bit of a deeper dive. The interesting part of this space, at least for right now, when we entered the COVID-19 era, one of the questions that came up was, we know pretty well, and I'll cover this later in the presentation, but we know pretty well what happens to human beings when they're hit with a single traumatic event. It occurs in a single space and time. We know how people react to those events. And you can, whether it's small scale type of point-based event like a shooting, or whether it's a large scale type of event like a hurricane or something else, we know generally how people react. Once the physical aspect of the event is over, people are generally able to start the recovery process. The challenge with what we've been through over the past few years is we've entered into this long duration crisis event that is non-geographic in nature, and we don't know when the end is actually going to occur. It was an interesting time frame to say, what does that do to the human body? What does that do to somebody's psyche? What does that do to their mental health? There's certainly been a lot of discussion on that. One of the things that ended up I launched into was tracking the level of stress each week throughout the pandemic. to see what does stacking stresses on a compound basis over a long-term period of time do to individuals. And what you were able to see in that data set are some of the things that unfortunately we are experiencing now. Increases in civil unrest, increases in aspects related to potential conflict and war, increase in issues related to violence themselves. We see lots of different things happening, homicides on the increase, violent crime on the increase. There are a lot of things going on that relate to, unfortunately, the time frame of COVID-19. The challenge with that, and we know this from New York, we know this from a few different case studies over the years, when you see an increase or spike like that, the tail becomes quite long. And so to try and get back to baseline where we were in potentially 2018 may take us 10 years or more, depending on how various administrations look at dealing with or trying to treat violence in the society as we see it today. So unfortunately, while COVID hopefully is the general risk is being reduced on a globalized basis, the outcomes of that from a violence perspective are likely to be with us for a significant period of time. The last thing, just from an insurance perspective, and then really want to get Harry's opinion on these. One of the ways I look at this from an insured element, this very much reminds me of watching the cyber movement over the past 10 years. It was really complicated in the beginning. Everybody thought they had coverage. Everybody assumed that the traditional coverages would step in and do what they wanted to in that cyber environment. What we realized over time, this became so complex and required additional pieces, additional coverages. And over time now, many of those coverages are simply contractually being mandated. Organizations have to have these things in place to show cyber duty of care. In many cases, I see that same wave developing in this aspect of workplace violence in the same way cyber was, and potentially even getting to the point of being contracted in from a duty of care perspective, that you're doing what you can to support employees. So lots of things to talk about as we get into it. But I want to turn it over now to Harry to get his opening comments.
Yeah, Hart, I agree with you 100%. I think that the same way that cyber developed is how you're going to see violence develop. I'm surprised it didn't develop in advance of cyber from the standpoint that this issue has always been around. We've had millions of incidents of workplace violence on an annual basis for many, many years, and a lot of it has gone unaddressed. So from an insurance perspective, I think there's a tremendous opportunity and need, and it goes both directions. You know, the insureds don't understand why they need it. They don't understand what is available. So there's a training aspect to it where we need to be able to train from the top down, from the, oh, we lost the screen again, I think, Hart. But that's okay. But I think that, well, let me back up just for a second to the numbers, you know, because I don't think a lot of people understand the growth that we've seen in violence over the past several years. And I don't think it's necessarily all attributable to COVID. I think COVID was a compounding factor. But when we did our year-end wrap-up, which we do for the insurance industry every year, at the end of 2019, we were shocked to announce to everybody that we had exceeded 400 mass shootings. So shootings that are defined as 4 or more victims for the year 2019, more than one a day. And when we did our 2020 wrap up, the number had hit 600. So 50% more than the greatest year we had had in history. And when we did the 2021 wrap up, we had exceeded 700. So the numbers have been escalating, but I will tell you, we attributed a lot of the 2019 numbers to what was going on in the United States with the division of our population, with the problems we were having with the election, with a lot of the other things that were driving people. So you're going to hear us talk a lot about some of those issues as we go further on in the presentation. But I think from in an insurance perspective, one of the things that it drove was workers' comp and GL carriers to start paying a lot more attention to the violence issues. We've seen assault and battery sublimits in a lot of the GL policies, or firearms exclusions being added into the GL policies. So there's no question that the insurers are starting to respond to this issue. The brokers are more aware of the issue and are seeing it as an E&O exposure for themselves if they don't address it, or if they allow there to be sublimits that haven't been addressed. And of course, the insureds themselves are becoming more aware of these issues because of technology. You know, everybody's carrying one of these things around in their pocket, and it's a tool by which they're getting information constantly on a daily basis. And as Hart said, there's a tremendous amount of media coverage that comes along with shootings, not just the mass shootings that we've been involved in, but even the day-to-day shootings. And it's not just shootings, it's stabbings, it's incidents of workplace violence that are involving all kinds of instrumentalities, including vehicles. So there's a lot to talk about in that space.
Great, thank you, Harry. And so with that, I will move on to talk about some of the things that you've seen over the past few years.
Well, I think as you indicated, Hart, the stressors that we've been living with, and this is not just, again, I don't want it to seem that we're focusing on COVID or on the political division in the United States or any one issue, but they are physical, they're psychological, they're social. I think I was working this morning on another presentation we're going to be doing for the university community next week. And one of the stressors that we were looking at is the stressor that social media feeds. And you know, you think about how technology has evolved the space that we live in, and it has absolutely changed. One of the slides we're going to get to are what I refer to as people who are sitting on the fence. So, you know, every small business, it doesn't matter if a small business has employees. Yeah, we don't need to back up one, Hart. We'll get to that in a second. But every business has employees, and a certain percentage of those employees come to work with financial problems, spousal problems, domestic issues of various kinds. You have drug and alcohol related issues, domestic violence, and those things are all weighing on those people day to day. Most of those people will never act out, but unfortunately, a certain percentage of them do. My organization deals with somewhere between 3 and 5, what we call crises a week. Now, some of those are actual shootings. Some of those are circumstances where people recognize an employee that's on a path to violence, and they want to know, how do we prevent this from becoming a workplace incident? So there's a lot, again, to be talked about, and there's a lot that insurers can do. I think it's both in the insurer's interest as well as the insured's interest to try and prevent these things from happening, because it becomes a frequency and severity issue for the insurer, and it becomes, you know, obviously a brand and reputation as well as just general workforce issue for the insured. So again, plenty to talk about, Hart.
Great, thank you very much. And speaking of sitting on the fence.
Well, this is a term that I coined years ago, because those people with all those problems, they're just sitting on the fence. And this really came about as a result of the work that we've done in the school community, both the K-12 as well as the university community, that when we look at these school shooters, they've been sitting on the fence for years. But, you know, and most of them stay there. In other words, they've got issues, whether it was bullying, whether it's situations at home, whatever it might be. Same as the employees of these small businesses, large businesses, any business, they bring that to the workplace with them. Now, the domestic violence piece, we should probably talk about in some detail, because leading or second leading cause of death for women in the workplace in any given year is in fact a boyfriend or a husband coming to the workplace to exact retribution for something that typically happened outside the workplace. But I think we can get into that a little bit more as we go on. But again, a certain percentage of these people get pushed off the fence, and that's happening more and more now as a result. For example, you look at what's going on right now with Russia and the Ukraine, the constant focus on violence. There's a certain percentage of people that are going to be sensitive and susceptible to that, and it's going to push them off the fence. And when it does, that has an impact on the small businesses that we're insuring, whether those are employees, customers, family members of employees or customers. It finds its way into the workplace and again, into the frequency and severity that we all experience as insurers.
Great, thank you for that. So I wanted to talk briefly. We hear a lot, and certainly Harry and I get this question, or get the statement that occurs, well, it's never going to happen to me, or it's not going to happen in my workplace. We all, we're one big happy family. We all know each other's children. We all spend time together outside of work. I hear all of this time and time again, unfortunately, after an event, as much as I do prior to an event. And so while it may be easy for some organizations to say, look, I don't have a gang problem, I don't have a terrorism problem, I'm not worried about people from the outside potentially coming in, but I wanted to talk briefly about what we see inside the workplace. And I want to give you some examples. Now, I have to be careful with some of the examples, as will Harry, as we go through the conversation, based on the kinds of clients that we work with. But just to give you an idea, when somebody says, I don't need this, this will never happen to me, it becomes harder when you present something like this. So these are the 5 types of things, 5 types of homicides that we see in the workplace on a recurring basis. The first one is argument. The classic example of argument is the parking lot. An argument occurs in the parking lot. It escalates very, very quickly. Somebody grabs a gun and the gun goes off. In one case, one of the more highly publicized cases, it went to there was a lawsuit filed after the case. It went to jury and a $70 million verdict was given to the family. So the parking lot incident, the type of incidents can obviously occur anywhere. And we see these time and time again. Yes.
Let me interrupt you for just a second and give you an example of one last week that we dealt with that is exactly what you said, and talk a little bit about how it may develop. We had a situation where one tenant of an apartment building in the parking lot, didn't like the way another tenant interacted with his dog. And it escalated, as you said, very quickly into a shooting. Now, as insurers, we might say, well, I don't see how that's going to ultimately affect my insured. Let me tell you the way that it is going to affect the insured. Just as background, I'm an attorney, although I never practice as one on behalf of the insureds or the insurers in these situations. But unfortunately, in most states in the United States, the family of the victim can bring an action against the landlord or against the property owner for failure to provide adequate security. And in most states, they don't have to bring any action against the perpetrator. So the only defendant in the case will be the landowner. And as Hart said, sometimes you see horrific verdicts because you got to remember, if we actually take it to trial, we're dealing with the whim of a jury. So these argument cases happen in real time in the real world every single day. So anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you. And on that, you can imagine a strip mall, and I had a client not too long ago in a strip mall type of scenario, had nothing to do with the case, the incident itself, but absolutely was impacted, as was all of the other tenants along the strip mall based on the parking lot event. The second one is conflict. Now, this gets a little bit difficult to separate in cases between argument and conflict. Conflict generally is you have the boyfriend, girlfriend type of situation. There's an ongoing, elongated event where it's unresolved. You have this unresolved conflict. We see these cases quite regularly in places like healthcare, where somebody's not happy with the services that they're getting. They're complaining. They're not being heard, and then ultimately they get upset. We see it in restaurants. Two customers in a restaurant come together. I had a case not too long ago in the restaurant. Come together. They're arguing over what appeared to be a girlfriend at the time. Employee of the restaurant tries to get in the middle just to stop or slow things down. A gun is pulled, and unfortunately, the event occurred in the restaurant. We also see it in places, as Harry, you just said, multi-habitation type of situations, these conflicts that are unresolved over a period of time that ultimately boil over.
We get a lot of conflicts in the human resource environment. Long-standing disagreements between employees, bosses, and their subordinates. Hiring, firing, and discipline result in a tremendous number of conflict situations and, unfortunately turn into workplace violence.
Thank you for that. And the next one there being revenge. Now, revenge is a little bit different. Typically, a single event starts a person off, takes them off the fence and starts them on a path. And they think about it time and time and time again. In many cases, they're fantasizing about doing it, but it leads to one specific event. Now, the challenge with this is the individual, the perpetrator, the offender may not even know the person they're going after. And the classic case last year that occurred was in Atlanta and was the spa events. The individual went from spa to spa on this revenge type of an approach, shooting individuals he didn't even know. And then when he was finished, ultimately was caught. And in many cases that occurs in these types of revenge events. It makes sense to the person that is doing it. It doesn't necessarily make sense to all of us that look at it in shock.
Yeah, we had a case this past year, Hart, in a restaurant where an ex-boyfriend came to the restaurant, killed the new boyfriend of the woman who also worked in the restaurant. The one that was killed didn't know the guy, didn't know that there was any outstanding issue, just had, it was truly an innocent victim.
Thank you again. And the next one, which we see actually more often in the workplace when it deals with employees on employees, and that is the authority issue. An employee doesn't like the supervisor. They don't like the owner. They don't like their boss. They don't like somebody else in the workplace that is an authority figure. They feel that they're pushing them down. They're not giving them an opportunity to be successful. Lots of different reasons why a grievance begins, but they start to see not just the supervisor, the boss, the owner, as the enemy. They start to see the entire organization, the institution. And so the outburst that occurs is against anybody that is involved with that organization. And that's normally when you see those. So those first three, in many cases, you'll see it's only one or two people that are involved in the event itself. In the authority event, you really start to see more of the spree types of situations, multiple individuals unfortunately killed in these types of events. We see, I've got a number of clients in manufacturing and distribution that are unfortunately dealing with these right now from an authority perspective, where the individuals just didn't like the organization and decided to take it out on the organization themselves.
Yeah, and Hart, being that we're talking about small business in this communication, a lot of times that small business authority is the small business owner and or family, and that has different ramifications because, as Hart indicated earlier, people believe it's not going to happen here. We know our people too well. We know their families, and unfortunately, that just compounds the problem very often. So the authority issue is a big one when we're talking about workplace violence in small business.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We talk a lot about communications. How do you communicate with employees? How do you start to ensure that those grievances don't start, especially with owners and so forth? The last one there is we refer to as non-specific, and it's really somewhat complex to try and decipher. Again, this makes sense to the mind of the shooter, but it may not make sense to everybody else. Normally, these events occur in public settings. They're spree events. A lot of people are potentially involved in public areas in many cases. So the large classic example is Vegas. where you see this non-specific type of mass or spree shooting. On a smaller scale, you see the Gilroy Garlic Festival type of situation, where an individual just jumped the fence and starts taking action. Knowing in those kinds of events, and here's one of the conversations we have certainly with the insurers is, look, you can have an event that occurs on premise, and that's we all understand what that means, or in a certain radius around the premises. But what happens if your employees are off-site working on your behalf or doing something on your behalf? In this case, I had a client at the festival at the time working on behalf of the organization, had nothing to do with them at all, but they were absolutely impacted by the event. And so some of these types of things do become important when you start talking about the insurance aspect of these cases. And now I know we're going to sort of jump into what are some of those elements. Yes, Harry.
Hang on one second, because you mentioned Gilroy. And of course, Gilroy is one of my clients. So I just wanted to point out that to people that the impacts of these things go on for years. So you may have seen recently, there was a TikTok call, a kid put out a thing for a national school shooting day. And most schools beefed up some security and paid attention. Gilroy actually closed their schools because of the emotional impact that had accumulated over the years. So going back to what Hart had indicated on an earlier slide, that cumulative effect, the cumulative effect on the city of Gilroy, as you can imagine, has been significant and dramatic. So these non-specific attacks are so hard for people to reconcile emotionally and otherwise. There's a real lingering effect that I think the insurance industry can really provide a lot of assistance with, because the insureds are no longer just looking for indemnification. They're looking for services before, during, and after. So they're looking for risk management, crisis management, other services to be provided. So, oh, look at that. It leads right into this slide.
So sort of changing gears, those are all of the things, the perils, the aspects that we need to address or think about from even a small business perspective. The second part of this is, what does the coverage actually entail? What are sort of some of the elements that you're looking for insureds to make sure that they understand what they're getting as part of the policy or the coverage itself? And so some of the things that Harry was mentioning, and I'm going to pull just a few of these out, but I can tell you, when you just look at that list overall on the screen, there's a lot of elements there. I had a case not too long ago where the premium was quite small for the policy that the organization purchased. They needed it. And at the end of the day, the question was, they went back and looked at how much the premium was, and they said, wait, I got all of this for that. And they were shocked. And so there's a lot of things that get put into these various policies. Some of these get very complex. Some of them are not complex, especially from a small business perspective. So I'm just going to grab a few, and I know Harry will have some in here as well. I'll take one here, site security, and that's sort of interesting in and of itself. You think, well, the police are going to come in and secure the site. Depends. One is, if the shooter's still on the loose, then you might get a police presence on site. If there was a shooting or something occurred, then you get the crime scene crew that may be on scene for a period of time. During that time frame, you may also need site security, or when the crime scene crew is done, you may need site security during that time frame. So in many cases, site security can show up within 30 minutes to a few hours and be on site as long as necessary to keep press away and ensure things are being done during that time frame. Yes, go ahead, Harry.
Can I comment on site security? Because there's another aspect to it, which is brand and reputation and employee retention. So we had a client recently who had a shooting in their facility, open late at night bar. They serve alcohol late into the evening. And they were concerned after everything was cleaned up, they were back in business, but they were concerned that patrons and employees viewed it as a safe place to visit. And they continued to have site security long after they needed it because they wanted to avoid the attrition issues in their employee force. And they wanted to make sure that patrons felt comfortable coming back to their facility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had some interesting conversations and interesting issues as well with clients, not just in the initial aspect of the site security, but I've had families come and say, look, we want to have a memorial service at the site of the business. And now we have lots of other issues to potentially contend with. So you're exactly right. Not just from a real risk perspective, but that perceived risk and making people feel comfortable. That security element is helpful to get on site pretty quickly. Public relations, PR, this is always an interesting conversation because immediately what people think are press conferences, big elaborate types of things and getting on camera. The reality in most of these cases is not that. However, it is something to be managed. I had a cannabis facility not too long ago. It was a parking lot event. Didn't necessarily involve them, although it did impact them pretty heavily. They didn't know what to say to the other tenants. They didn't know what to say to their employees. They didn't know what to say to their vendors. All of those kinds of really detailed types of things were not something that they had thought through. That was a relatively low level, relatively simple sort of PR component to it. Some of these get very complex. National news shows up if it's a larger event. Do you have a holding statement and starting to manage the media from that perspective, manage social media from that perspective, manage clients and customers calling, asking questions as to what happened with FAQs and those kinds of things that your employees can answer questions to. So there's a lot of things besides what most people believe, oh, I don't need PR. I'm never going to, go and do a press conference on camera. But there are a lot of different things that need to be said to certain individuals that are important, and the timing of being able to say that does become important as well. So it needs to be scripted if it's done right. Another one. Yes, go ahead.
Let me jump in again, Hart, because you know that this particular issue is one that's very near and dear to my heart. My firm doesn't believe in the words public relations in a crisis situation. We believe that that's crisis communications, but there is a need for public relations in the before and the after pieces, but not the during. But when the shootings took place at Virginia Tech, President Steger called me. And when we arrived on campus, there were 140 satellite trucks and there were hundreds of reporters. That's an environment no one knows how to exist in. That's what we call business unusual. And I think a large part of what Hart's talking about in this whole presentation is exactly that. When your insureds are faced with business unusual, they know how to run their bar, their restaurant, whatever. That's business as usual for them. When they start trying to do things that are outside of their skill set, that's when they get into this whole public relations issue. So that when the news shows up on their property and sticks a microphone in their face, or someone shooting B-roll footage of their sign, or all the different things that we know are going to happen when there's been a workplace violence incident, they have no idea how to address it. And more importantly, they don't know who to call. So an insurer providing them with those kind of skills and services really makes insured retention a big issue. I mean, it's so helpful in the process. The brokers are happy, the agents are happy, the insureds are happy because they got services that they never expected to get, as Hart was indicating before. It gives them a much more holistic approach to risk management as opposed to just an indemnification policy.
Absolutely. And with that the next one I'm going to pull out just briefly is mental health. And for that, there are a number of things that happen that are important in a few different contexts. First, from an individual perspective, what happens after these events? The normal individual in trying to deal or cope with these kinds of things is going to go through three different aspects. One is grief. That makes sense if there has been a loss. The next one is guilt. And the aspect of guilt becomes important because what they end up doing is they start asking themselves questions. Why didn't I see it sooner? Why didn't I do something different? Why didn't I turn left rather than right? Why didn't I do all of these kinds of things? That reliving the process is, if not dealt with appropriately, can be quite difficult for people to overcome. And so you see that starting to lead into things like PTSD. From a psychological perspective, we always look at it from the fact that, yes, the event was traumatic, but reliving the event over and over and over again becomes even more traumatic in some cases than the event itself. So it becomes difficult to compensate. The last one there is anger. People have a tendency to start to get angry. Why did this happen to me? And they want a narrative. They want something to fill in that gap in order to reduce the potential anger. If that anger is not addressed in some form or fashion, it turns into blame. Then they start to blame the organization, and that blame ends up turning into lawsuits. And so this mental health aspect in the first 72 hours out to about a week becomes incredibly important to stop those cycles, to create those narratives and make sure that people understand and put into context what they just experienced. Not easy to do, but it is important. After about a week, we start to see people readjust, and in many cases start to bounce back or adapt during that time frame. Then we see a few individuals, typically 10% of the individuals that were involved in the event, that are still struggling in about 30 days. That's typically in that 30-day time frame where we start to see people transition into work comp. And they could be on that for a significant period of time. We have in previous cases people that are in that process for over a year. Then we think after 30 days out to that year timeframe, which Harry mentioned as well, is anytime you start to, the next time somebody pulls a fire alarm or you have a fire sort of evacuation drill, anytime you have something else, a sight, a sound, a smell, becomes these reactivating events. And so it becomes important for the business owner to have this plan in place. And we help structure those plans for the remainder of the year for when things start to occur, that they know what to do to keep the business on track. So the mental health aspect is really important, not just from that individual perspective, but holistically for an organization to be able to get right during that first 7 days, which is tough to do. Those were the ones I wanted to hit briefly before we start talking about the broader coverage gaps. Anything else from you, Harry, on this one?
No, you triggered a few things in my mind, but I think we're going to cover them maybe next. So let me see let's see where we're going. And then, yeah, this is exactly what you were triggering in my mind. So that's perfect.
Perfect. So that from not just the insureds, but from the insurance community themselves, in many cases, we're asked these questions because we have to navigate these almost on a daily basis. You know, Harry talked about all of the cases and different things that they're seeing in rapid succession as to how these things either play well together or you start to see the gaps as to why this type of coverage, unfortunately, is needed in today's environment. And what you see just from a broad basis, you know, general liability, it is there, and in many cases, it does cover bodily injury. But you're starting to see, just like we saw in cyber, you're starting to see more and more exclusions creep in to general liability. So that it's something to keep in mind and make sure that you're watching what's going on with the GL policies to see if there is an exclusion that becomes important to you. The second aspect of general liability is it generally requires a lawsuit to be filed. And that may not occur for a year or more, depending on the nature of the situation, before you get any support or help. That's a significant amount of time that becomes important to you, especially when we're talking about 7 days, 30 days to get the business back up and running. Work comp, another avenue where people say, well, I've got this, I've got work comp, so I should be fine. The challenge that we've seen, certainly in dealing with these cases from a work comp perspective, one, it takes time to get people into work comp, and two, that work comp doesn't always address the mental aspect as quickly as we would like them to from a policy or claims perspective. And so one of the classic cases that has come in that many of you may be familiar with, but was San Bernardino. And in the San Bernardino case, they tried to use traditional means, so general liability, work comp, to address some of the acute needs of the organization at the time. And unfortunately, the delays that were experienced during that timeframe resulted in an entire division never coming back to work. And so understanding these things weren't built for this type of acute situation that requires, immediacy within hours, within a day or so to start this response process. And that's where you see the reason or the rationale behind these dedicated coverages to provide that immediacy, 24/7, 365 support via phone call. Hopefully everybody that has a program knows their phone call, that knows the phone number. And we see that that's a challenge. In many cases, I can tell you that there's two big challenges in these cases. One, if I get a phone call on a Thursday night, that's a challenge. In the fact that I know I've got 7 days to start piecing things back together. And if I lose people over the weekend, that means I've got to get everything started on Friday very, very quickly in order to not lose the weekend and then find myself behind everything that's going on. So that's the first one. The second one is as I get a phone call, and I know, Harry, you've dealt with these as well. You get a phone call 7 days, 14 days out from the event. And at that point, you've really lost a lot of the ability to manage that acute aspect. That blame aspect is starting to creep in, that anger to blame to lawsuit. A lot of things are starting to play out that become very difficult to address when you start trying to engage from a crisis management perspective, weeks after the event. But Harry, love to get your thoughts.
I think you're dead on accurate. I think I can tell many stories, but one that might interest the people listening today, we had a restaurant situation where there was a shooting. The policy where we were responding was on behalf of the Deadly Weapons Active Shooter provider. And we were there immediately. We were literally on site. There was lots of turmoil, as you can imagine. We had to identify who was actually even in the building. But I think the important part is, as Hart was saying, it's those first minutes and hours of a crisis that are going to determine the way it unfolds over time. In this particular situation, we were able to provide the victims and the victims' families with immediate response. We helped take care of their medical bills. We dealt with issues so that they didn't develop that level of anger and blame that will happen. I guarantee will happen if they're left to their own devices. Similarly, when they did ultimately hire an attorney, their position was that they were looking to be compensated as opposed to penalizing the organization. So it's a very different mindset if you can get in there early. The workers' comp and the general liability carriers showed up about a month later because their policies were triggered by a claim. The claim hadn't been filed, so they didn't open their file and didn't provide any services to the insured or to the victims or the victims' families. They came to us and they said, can we have your investigative materials? Because everyone should understand the police will not share their investigative materials, and especially if it's still an active investigation. So there's a huge gap between primary coverages like workers' comp and general liability and a workplace violence, deadly weapons, active shooter, whatever the term that you're using might be. But again, it's those first minutes and hours. The other problem we always find with the other primary coverages is they have not identified on behalf of the insured a responder who has experience in responding to those type of events. They'll very often indicate that there's some coverage for crisis management, but the insured has to first go looking on their own, and they have no idea how to handle that. So I think, Hart, you're right on. I mean, this slide is right on topic. I mean, it's providing those services, again, reduces frequency and severity, but I think more importantly, provides a level of satisfaction at the insured level that both prevents them from leaving a carrier and also gives a competitive advantage over the carriers who aren't providing those services.
Great, thank you very much. So with that, I think we are pretty close to being on time and wanted to leave at least 10 minutes or so for questions from the group. So I'd love to turn it back over and see, do we have questions at this point?
Thanks, Harry and Hart. Let's see, I'll look around here. Any questions?
Everybody just had lunch, so they're probably sleeping.
Yeah, no, they're all awake still. So credit to both of you. You succeeded. Everyone's awake. I had a question. You talked a lot about the restaurants, things like that. A lot of their mutual friends here, they write, BOP accounts and small packages. I thought it was great points about the GL and comp, where when something happens, what do they do? Any other classes? I think, Harry, in the past, we talked about things that are alarming. They may not know, like bowling alleys. Would you like to talk about some of these classes that are just sort of scream of some challenges?
Well, it's interesting. I don't want to necessarily disparage any class, but the reality is every business, it doesn't look, we've had barbershop shootings, we've had problems in beauty salons, restaurants, bars, casinos, schools, universities. I mean, literally, you can't name a class where we have not had problems. Now, we talked earlier about, depending on the year, anywhere between somewhere around 60,000 shootings in the United States. Those shootings are about 1/3 self-inflicted, so suicides. There's about another third of or about half of the remainder that take place in a residential setting. So obviously, if they're taking place in a residential setting, now we start talking about apartments, condos, hotels, all kinds of things like that are very difficult to write. They're very difficult to manage that whole process. So, I mean, Tim, it literally can be any business, every business, anyone who deals with people, anyone who's got customers, anyone who's got employees, every single business has this exposure. Hart, I don't know what you think about that, but
from a pure risk perspective, and I agree with you, Harry, anybody dealing with the population, but from a pure risk perspective, 3 of the areas that we see sort of get the most traction or most have the biggest challenges. One is healthcare. They consistently have the highest number of workplace violence events, and you can think about it in a number of different ways. I don't have to bring a weapon into a healthcare facility. There's plenty around that I just need to grab if I want to, even though in many cases I can still bring a weapon or whatever it may be in. So those types of situations in healthcare we see quite often. Restaurants and nightclubs, we're seeing more and more, even from a GL perspective in restaurants and nightclubs, a push because they've been hit on the GL. They're specifically trying to exclude things like assault. And then the last area there is the multi-tenant types of facilities. And the rationale behind that is you just have no idea. You don't know everybody that's going to be in whether it's an apartment complex, whether it's a small business along a strip center. You just don't know who else is going to be there, and then it impacts you. Those are 3 of the areas that we see from a purely risk perspective.
Okay, thank you. Let me look around and see if any other comments, or everyone's good. Oh, we have a question here.
So super enlightening presentation. Thank you. I'm just curious about what percentage of incidents that you have been involved with that you found have had actual workplace violence insurance in place to help them through.
You want to go first, Hart?
Well, go ahead, because I know your answer already.
Well, it depends when you say workplace violence. I mean, obviously, I would say a large percentage of them have had general liability or you got to remember, in a lot of cases, if there's an employee involved, workers' comp is an exclusive remedy in most states for any injury to an employee. However, there's a lot of things that fall outside, and the victim and victim family management, the family management piece of it is never covered. And very few, we've been involved in cases that have active shooter coverage, for example, and that active shooter, unfortunately, is not broad enough. It's not taking into account the way in which these things occur. So you need a much broader kind of coverage. So I think the answer is very few have effective coverage. Most of them have some type of coverage.
And I would just say from those that have purchased a specific type of coverage related to this, again, workplace violence, active shooter, deadly weapons, lots of different names for them that have, so they've purchased or they've had coverage, they've had an event and they've triggered the coverage. Those are actually three potentially different questions, because I have some that have had coverage and never triggered it, even though they should have. You're probably looking, when you combine those three elements together, 5% of the shooting events or less likely had coverage. They knew what they were doing with it. They triggered it. They got the help they needed during that time frame. So a relatively small number, which is why, again, I kind of go back to the cyber wave. I think we're going to see more and more insureds looking to get these types of coverages simply because the events are happening too frequently.
Well, I think you're right, Hart. And I think the other issue for the insureds is going to be and is that it's now being recognized as a best practice. So if you don't have the coverage, if your broker hasn't offered you the coverage, there's going to be a lot of issues that arise as a result of that.
Okay, thanks. And just one last, anyone else? All right, well, right up the 5 minutes to the hour. That's perfect timing as we set up our next session. Thank you to both of you, Harry and Hart, for beaming in from Colorado and Oklahoma. So we appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you soon.
We appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
So we got a slight break before we set up for our 2 o'clock weather property. So we'll just roll right into it as we set up. Okay, it looks like most people came back in. And so for our final session today, by the way, thank you for everyone coming back after lunch. And like we said on last session, everyone stayed awake. So that was the hard part. Now this session's easy. It's easy. So 2 to 3. We're on the final stretch. The name of this session is Property Damage Resulting from Weather Changes. We have 2 wonderful guests from 2 wonderful companies, Guy Carpenter and from Munich Re. James Waller is from Guy Carpenter, and Ed is from Munich Re. So I'll let them introduce themselves with their wonderful background, and we'll kick off with James, if that's okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name's Jim. I work at Guy Carpenter. I'm just going to do a brief intro and then turn it over to Ed for some prepared remarks. But my own background, I'm a meteorologist at Guy Carpenter, signed on 10 years ago. Right ahead of Sandy, which was a unique time to join the industry and not knowing what a deductible was. I learned very quickly along the way. Prior to that, I worked in the engineering climatology space, helping with tornado climatology and snow loads and wind loads for interest around the Toronto metro region. Grad degrees in meteorology from Florida State University, and a long time ago in engineering from the University of Waterloo up in Canada. And at Guy Carpenter, I help out with testing and evaluation of catastrophe models, helping the companies that we work with come to terms with how the CAP models think or maybe don't think. I help out with questions around event response, often around what happened during an event. Sandy's a classic example, and just understanding of the hazards and how they are evolving. And there are some subtleties there, and we'll get forward to speaking with you. Over to Ed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can you hear me okay? Yep, perfect. So I'm Ed Bojanowski, working for Munich Re. I'm currently the US strategy lead, and I'll unpack that in a little bit. But to give you a background, I myself am from DuPont, Pennsylvania. I went to Temple University, self-described insurance nerd. So I did not end up in this industry by accident. So I'm one of the weird ones. But I began my career with Munich Re in their trainee program back in 2009. I spent 5 years with Munich Re in the US, property treaty underwriting, mainly regionals, super regionals, many companies located within Pennsylvania. And then I moved actually to Munich, where I spent 5 years working in the global headquarters of Munich Re, working with global clients, as well as a bunch of different projects, kind of corporate, when you're there, you're kind of in the hub of everything. So trying to get my hands in as much as I could. I actually then left Munich Re for a brief pause to pursue my MBA at London Business School. And so now I'm rejoining the group. I rejoined back in April. And what I'm focused on now is looking at the US operations of Munich Re and aligning a number of different individual areas or entities that we have so that we're looking at similar underwriting appetites, that we have an understanding of that one view or one voice in the market. So a large portion of this, though, is focused on our property book, which I get a chance then to work with many colleagues all over the US. So I have to say, I'm very excited to be with you. Thank you again for having me. I'm upset, though, I can't be there in person. So I promise next year I will be there live. Do you want me to just kick off then? Is that okay? Okay. So today what we wanted to talk about is, of course, where is the future of kind of some of the weather events that we're seeing? But I think what's important before we kind of tee that part up is to go into some of the inflation trends that we're seeing. So I think, if the intention was to keep you guys up, I'm going to show you some pretty scary numbers here. No doubt, worldwide, globally, we've seen a massive spike in inflation. It's not just the US, this is pretty much all advanced economies. And a large portion of that is the supply and demand imbalances, which I would say many believed that this was going to be transitory. But the question now we're seeing is, how long is this going to last? And of course, you have a crisis in Ukraine at this point, which is sort of the all bets are off at this stage. And it's not to sound a warning here. It is just to say, we're at a period of dramatic uncertainty, particularly for property affected business, that I don't think that we've quite seen in decades. So what does that mean, though, for the US? I have to say, I just got a email that CPI was released for February. So we've hit a new record 40-year high. It was 7.6 in January. Now it's 7.9 in February. And these are strong headwinds as we look at portfolios, whether it's individual, residential or non-residential. All of these areas are going to be affected, and it's not just necessarily the inflation of the materials. It's also labor costs. It's also insurance to value on the front end, right? There's a lot of different things that are occurring right now that we've seen. I think just challenges in general. So to give you some numbers, and I've borrowed this from the APCIA, but loss adjustment expenses increasing, homeowners losses up 40% from 19 to 2021, where rates have only gone up 8.4. So this is putting not only a pressure on profitability, but ultimately understanding, if I'm buying, for instance, reinsurance, or I'm buying a cat cover, how much should I buy, right? There is that question around the uncertainty of the magnitude of what a loss could be. And again, these main drivers, very much all over the news, cost inputs again, natural disasters. This is the 7th year of where we've had 10 losses over $1 billion. This is double the 20-year average. So that's been putting a lot of pressure just on the market as well. But you also have property development, right? So you've got two things that are going on there, where people are building more into hazard-prone areas that weren't there before. It's kind of always like the tornado in a cornfield thing. The house wasn't there before. But you also have, at the same time, neighborhoods or areas where aging infrastructure, aging homes. It's the question around the vulnerabilities that we're understanding. How likely is that individual property to be hit? And of course, the older that it gets, the more the vulnerability changes. And then, of course, risk adequacy. So meaning you've got some areas that are looking to harden the risks, so making that risk a better risk. Let's say, a great example of that would be California wildfire brush, removing those things, but also understanding what is the true cost of risk? ITV, insurance to value, the change in replacement costs that we're seeing. That is something where it's just, again, a massive uncertainty. So again, not to go too much into some of the material prices, but they're up, right? And you know, ultimately, what we're seeing is potential as well of it's not only the construction materials of getting things to a site, but it's also then the labor of building. And that what we're seeing now develop is the potential for, okay, on the residential side, you've got projects that are extending further. On the commercial side, though, you've also got the BI component. And the BI component is starting to show signs that these projects being delayed because of some of this material are now causing even bigger losses on the BI side than we had anticipated. Residential property as well, you know, much higher than pre-COVID. So there's no respite, whether it's commercial or whether it's residential or non-residential. And I wanted to say, though, it's not just necessarily inflation that we're seeing in material prices. We're also seeing a social inflation, and this idea that as we have more and more litigations or nuclear verdicts or abilities where you're just giving out much larger claims than would have been in the past. And this number I thought was quite interesting from the CIS research paper, where if you look over 10 years, social inflation alone, increasing commercial auto claims and costs by over 20 billion. I mean, that's a big number. That's a really big number. And it's the question of, well, when is it or is it going to end, or how would we? Is that tort reform? Is that just exiting certain capacity, like certain markets, reducing the amount of capacity that you have? That I think is a big question mark as well, compounded by the fact that you've got so many issues on the property side. You still have issues on the casualty side. I think that is again, a headwind going into 2022. And to see, unclear, will COVID still have an impact as things start to open, as life kind of returns to a new normal? What can we expect? I think that again is the uncertainty. But I want to take let's now get into the weather events. And I went back in time for you guys. 1985 was the first and only recording of a F5 tornado in Pennsylvania. And I did not know this, and I've not been here, but apparently it's pretty cool. It's the Kinsua Bridge in McKean County. You can see here a before and after where the F5 really just ripped through this bridge. And because of the nature of where it is, it's still there, and it's a hiking trail now. So if you want to get your boots out and go for a walk, I've heard it's pretty cool. But I demonstrate this to show that tornadoes or strong tornadoes in Pennsylvania, particularly, they're infrequent, but they can happen. And the challenge then ultimately is, well, how do we manage around something that's so completely random? So I pulled a couple events though. I went to our friends at PCS, kind of looking through events that include Pennsylvania. So this would be the Mid-Atlantic. Inflation adjusted, I've made some assumptions there, but I wanted to just illustrate when we think about severity and frequency, there's a little bit of a trend frequency, from years past, but I don't necessarily know how much of this can be explained from a severity to frequency standpoint based on the number of losses or then the size of those losses. I can say though, and this was a joke that I had made earlier, that I think I need to run some sort of a regression or correlation analysis around hurricanes that begin with the letter I and their effect on Pennsylvania. I don't know. It's just Ivan, Irene. It just seems like there's something there that I've got to figure out. But you could definitely see in the past few years, particularly going back to 2018, that there is this increase in both frequency and severity. And the question then is, well, how much of this is going to be a new normal? How much of this might be a effect of climate change? Will we see a shifting of some of whether it's Tornado Alley? Will there be more storms? I think personally, this winter, I don't think was too terrible, though it was my first East Coast winter back in the States, and I forgot how cold it actually can get. And so, but the point here is, as we go through the cycle, we're having an uncertainty around what is the actual cost of risk. We have an uncertainty around when will losses occur based on the randomness of events. but also an uncertainty around, well, what is this trend to expect? How can I manage my portfolio into the future? Some good news, though. I pulled this from one of our meteorologists who had done looking at some of the studies, saying that there is a statistically significant increase in thunderstorm ingredients, right? So that's like east of the Rockies, we have that potential for more storms. Particularly hail is becoming a big question mark as well. One of the meteorologists, and I really liked this analogy, he went through and said, well, the challenge with climate change is that it's like when an athlete might take a performing enhancing drug, and they get really, really big, and they're juiced, I think is what he called it. But this idea that when you have warmer weather, warmer climate, the impact on that makes hail, and it doesn't take a lot to go from 2 to 5, right, like inches in terms of whether it's a softball size hail. And that challenge ultimately becomes, you've got ingredients here for even worse events. And it's not that dissimilar to actually, it's not too uncommon for that to actually happen. But I think, one of the questions of is Pennsylvania in a new normal? I say no. That's my vote. I say, we've definitely seen a marked increase in frequency. Definitely a number of events, we've had some big losses here in the past couple of years, but the experience at this stage doesn't necessarily suggest we're in a completely new normal. Kind of where I started here, I think inflation is more of a pressing and immediate concern. Likely will be a challenge into 2023. As we go into hurricane season as well, I think that's something we need to be conscious of, where, that a big event as well would just exacerbate things and make it even worse. So I think one of the things that, when we get back to our desks, like, okay, well, what do we do? For me, it's, I think portfolio diversification, right? The risk adequacy in pricing. It's not just about, let's say, what you're charging, but also kind of where these areas are located. And if things are very random from an event standpoint, having a spread is always helpful. But 2022 market's likely to remain firm. All indications are that we're still in a hard market or a firm market. And in particular, what we're focusing on, or what we think are the sort of trends to watch here, model uncertainty. So for instance, with whether it's RMS or upcoming AIR update, does this really reflect what the risk might actually be? We have this situation where a number of events are occurring and you are kind of playing catch up. And so when you have all of this new data and you put it into the model, and if you're still having that increased potential, are we really getting the right price there? So that's something that we're looking at, understanding where, as a reinsurer, do you look at both the model severity, the model frequency, and then, of course, client experience, things like this. But also, again, that change in vulnerability. So, you've got, again, new buildings and old buildings. And the question then is, are the underlying assumptions that we're making the right assumptions based on that particular property or where it may be located? You think about the WUI, right? All of the California wildfires that you're having now. That is also the question too, of like, just how does new and old build, how are we going to think about building codes in the future? Where will people actually start doing this? So a lot of just kind of where are things going from the risk itself. Event shift. So event shift, keeping an eye on, are we seeing that Tornado Alley kind of expand a bit further east, a bit further west? I think, and again, my meteorologist friend said, it's kind of like the goalposts are moving a bit, where, you used to have a pretty defined corridor of timing of when the events would occur. Now that's kind of expanding a bit. Tornadoes in December, right? It's that kind of question around, well, is that something that's going to continue? And if it does, do we have the seasonality that we thought we once had? Is that no longer the case? And another section here, of course, just resilience. I think that's a big point for Munich Re as we go forward into the future, is that the importance of adequate risk taking. All right, what does that even mean, right? Portfolio. We want to make sure that, yeah, of course, we understand the risks that we take, but we also want to make sure that individuals understand the risks that they are exposed to. There is a massive insurance gap. It does exist in many different areas, many different perils, but it's the idea of also not just that one individual, but also the communities that we live in. Now, how can we act braver? How can we be bolder? I think insurance has the ability to give people more confidence. It has the ability to take away stress and worry. I think we're cool. I know a lot of a lot of people don't, but for me, it's that question of how do we want to craft what the insurance industry is in the future? And I think a resilience, community focus, looking at risks from a different perspective. How do we make a town more safe, right? How do we avoid wildfires, or how do we have that preparation? I think all of those things from a community standpoint become more important for us in the future. So, I know I'm a little bit early here. I will definitely pass it over to my counterpart here, but I think I'll save any questions for the end here. I'm happy to talk about weather or inflation or climate change or anything, Germany. But thank you again for having me. I look forward to having some questions later.
Ed, thank you very much. I'm just kickstarting my presentation here and we'll be with you momentarily. And the folks in the back will give me a thumbs up when we're good to go. Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's great to speak with you in person instead of over WebEx for a change. I appreciate the comments from Ed and very timely. Inflation and the economic trends that he mentioned are very much in front of mind for a number of the companies that I speak with regularly. I'm going to close the loop on some of the economic trends and then talk about what we're seeing on the physical side in terms of the weather and climate hazards. Some of them are apparent, some of them are more muted and subtle, and all very much of interest to the people in this room in support of our efforts in the insurance industry. So what we're looking at here is a picture of an outline of the Joplin tornado in black in a hypothetical population footprint, with very urbanized areas shown in red, suburban areas in orange, exurban in yellow, and then rural areas in gray. And if you look at the time scales from left to right, we start early, move a little bit later, move to present day, and then go to 2100. And what you can see is common to what we see in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area and many of the major urban areas across the United States, with a gradually expanding urban footprint. And as these expand over time, the number of population and housing units and business units within these urban areas continues to expand and build out. And that means that the probability of catching one of these events increases over time. The chances of catching a hail streak increase over time. The chances of catching a tornado increase over time due to economic factors alone, due to socioeconomic factors alone. And according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the risk will increase due to economic factors alone. There's a couple of sentences that speak exactly to that. And that is an important statement, and that will drive up risk irrespective of the hazard. And when you think about your market share relative to these population centers, that's an important vector to keep an eye on. When we think about the comments from Ed, just about knowing your portfolio, knowing where the hot spots and the cold spots are and how those are evolving, that's an important piece of something that we can do to take action to look these issues in the eye and get ahead of them in support of our own companies and in the support of policyholders. Speaking of physical trends, there are a couple that are very apparent, others that are more subtle. When we think about sea level rise, that's unequivocal. We've seen an increase of 1 foot at the Battery over the last 100 years, give or take. And we're projecting an increase on the order of maybe 2 to 4 feet by the end of the century, maybe half that by the 2050s. The wild card is if the Antarctic ice sheet collapses or not. That could drive those numbers up. But that's an important one to keep an eye on. Whether you write flood or not, The effects of seawater inundation on coastal properties can affect wind-only riders, those that have an interest in wind and flood. It's a very important one to keep an eye on. I'll talk more about that in just a bit. The other one that's unequivocal is an increase in warm season, heavy 1 to 2 inch per hour rainfall events. There's unequivocal evidence that that's increasing on a global basis. Those are those crazy deep summer, heavy rainfall, what we used to call gully washers, where my ancestors grew up. Those are increasing on a global basis, both in terms of frequency and severity. And if you think of the 2 weeks prior to what Ida did in the state of Pennsylvania, that helped to preload some of the effects that we saw during the time that Ida actually passed. So that's unequivocal. The number of heat waves are on an increase. That is important from a time element perspective and business interruption perspective. Certainly in those areas that might have strained power grids, which is a good number of portions across the United States. That has implications for wildfire as well. Wildfire likes to spread in hot, dry periods. And if they last just a little bit longer, the number of days where a wildfire could spread would increase. Ignition is tricky because it depends on humans and what they're doing. There's a guy at the Missoula Fire Lab that was able to start a fire just from a rifle blast. He was able to put it out. He's a trained firefighter, but just random stuff happens, and that will not be going away. Neither will lightning strikes. Winter weather is tough. It's hard to tell whether there are any trends baked in. There might be some changes happening in the extremes as the weather patterns slow down. Nothing unequivocal as yet, but it's something that we're keeping an eye on. And if you think of winter weather lingering just a bit longer than it should, it can lead to some interesting impacts in terms of roof collapse and ice damming effects like we saw in 2015 up in New England. When it comes to hurricane and severe thunderstorm, the trends are more muted and more subtle. I'll talk about those in more detail. Here's a picture of sea level rise. When you look at Sandy on the right-hand side, the column on the right, the orange slashed rows in the middle tell you how much sea level rise contributed to the impacts for each of these storms. So Sandy's the one on the right. There are a few other storms to the left. And you can see that without sea level rise, the impacts would not have been as severe. Again, we've seen an increase on the order of 1 foot over the last century. Projections indicate 2 to 4 feet by the year 2100. I will not care by them, but I think the industry will, and certainly the mortgage space will. And there are some interesting effects going on. Why do we care about this? Well, because it compacts the return periods of seawater inundation events, whether it's from a heavy nor'easter like we saw in March of 2017, I think it was, or the December 92 nor'easter, or Sandy, or the next one. You think of the inundation depth of seawater and the scope of inundation, and that gradually increasing and taking a gradually deeper and deeper bite out of affected properties, that's not a trivial matter. When you think about natural gas lines having to be replaced entirely across coastal New Jersey in affected areas, that's not trivial and it's not cheap, and that will not be going away. And again, projections for an increase through the year 2100. I get a lot of questions about hurricane frequency by severity, and I'm just trying to trick this into advancing. I talked about coastal flood. I talked about heavy rainfall. Hurricanes like to produce excessive rainfall, 1 to 2 inches an hour. There's some evidence that they might be slowing down, and some evidence that that circulation within a hurricane might be working more aggressively. And the outcome of that is that it rains harder. And if it rains harder, there will be freshwater flood impacts. And the other outcome of that is it backs up your sewer systems, which are backed up by seawater inundation, and things can't drain as well. So again, if you're a wind-only rider, you can still get sideways impacts from that. And it's something, again, that's of interest to the industry at large. We have less exposure to coastal flood and seawater inundation in the state of Pennsylvania, but when you think about what the Delaware Bay could do if you get a hurricane in just the right spot, and some of the effects that we saw from tidal flooding up the Schuylkill River under Ida, there's some funky things that can happen with excessive rainfall production. The question I get most often is around frequency by severity. To date, we have not seen any hard trends in terms of hurricane frequency. What we're looking at on the top right is a picture of hurricane landfalls for the continental United States. And if you do a 3-year trend ending in 2017, it looks terrifying. Right? But when you step back and go cross-eyed a little bit and defocus and look at things over the longer term from 1900 to present day, there's a lot of volatility from year to year. No evidence of an upward trend. In fact, prior to 2017, there was a slight downward shift, and then the 2017 hurricane season happened. That volatility is really the point I want to draw out. We could get the big one any year. It could affect any portfolio in this room any given year. There might be two. And predicting this is something that cannot be reliably done prior to 7 to 10 days out. Hurricane landfall depends on what steering currents are doing at the time of the storm, and whether they carry the storm into the mainland or carry it harmlessly out to sea where it will just stir up fish. That volatility, the typical landfall to basin ratio is around 20 to 25%, but again, with a wide margin around that number and a lot of volatility from year to year. That number ranges anywhere between 0 to 86%. And we don't know what year it's going to be our turn. And we have to be ready for it. That's just the nature of the business that we work in. I get questions around hurricane severity. Again, no apparent trends. There's evidence that we're in a more active period since 1995. There are a combination of factors that contribute to that. Natural variability and maybe some climate change signals as sea surface temperatures increase. But again, with the year-to-year noise, it's hard to pull out what the trends actually are. Projecting forward, hurricane frequency likely to remain the same or maybe even downshift a little bit. But with increasing sea surface temperatures, it increases the speed limit to which a hurricane can intensify. And that means more Cat 4s and 5s. Is it going to double next year? No. But again, on a decadal basis, projecting forward, we will be seeing a higher number of these severe Category 4 and 5, and maybe even Category 3 hurricanes over time. And that's something that we'll need to keep an eye on. So the risk in 2023 relative to 2022, the expected value is not going to change really. But again, over the coming decades, that's the time scale where these changes will be manifest. And that really hits the sweet spot from a strategic planning perspective and an ERM perspective where we in the industry can get ahead of some of these issues. So this will not be going away. The picture on the bottom right, by the way, shows that frequency of landfall for the continental US versus what's happening in the basin with a lot of volatility from year to year. 2010, we didn't see any US landfalls, but it was one of the most active seasons in the basin. We saw 12 hurricanes that year. Canada had more landfalls than the US. When you look at 1986, 86% of storms in the basin made landfall. And that's the other year where we saw 6 hurricane landfalls prior to the year 2020. So it's happened before. It will likely happen again. Will it happen every year? Doesn't seem so. And again, in the industry, we can look these issues in the eye and get ahead of it with an idea and some awareness of what projections are telling us about hurricane severity so that we can be ready for the tough ones when they happen. Changing gears to severe thunderstorm. The trends are more subtle, but when we look at hail is pretty apparent. What we're looking at here is a picture of a trend in days where the environment was charged and primed to produce significant hail of 2 inches diameter or more. So it's a trend in days where the environment was enabled with the safety off to produce significant hail. It's a vulgar analogy given the earlier discussion, but I think it's informative. And what we see here are some cool spots in certain parts of the country on the Front Range of Colorado. But when we look at the bulk of the eastern US, especially along the Mississippi Valley, in context of what Ed was showing us before, Colorado Rockies, and certainly in the state of Pennsylvania, there has been a slow upward drift in days that could produce significant hail. These are hail environments. This is something that has been objectively measured and observed according to research by Tang and Gensani et al. And when you think about your market share in Pennsylvania and the other states of interest, especially in those black hatched regions where these changes are statistically significant, that might explain some of what has been happening to certain books in the room over the last 10 to 20 years or so. The trends might not be that loud in New York State, but when you think about the relatively short season in the state of New York and the shorter summer, these changes are not trivial and are really on the order of 10 to 20% relative to the mean. So something to be aware of, again, from a strategic planning and an ERM perspective. The other piece of that is that the CAP models for severe thunderstorm will last updated in approximately 2013 with AIR Touchstone 2 and RMS version 13.1. And this is relatively recent research. A CAP model is only so good as the science and engineering knowledge supporting it. And there have been some changes since the last release of the severe thunderstorm models. AIR is putting their next update out this summer, and RMS is working on theirs. And much as I enjoy model bashing, I'm looking forward to seeing some of these updates. And I will treat it objectively in spite of my last statement. And we will come to some consensus on what gets us closer to the truth. There's three classes of model. There's wrong, there's less wrong, and useless. We like the middle category, and I'm hopeful after discussion with the vendors that we'll land in the middle category. And as always, we'll find out what is close to right for the industry at large and make our way forward accordingly. This is a similar picture for tornadoes. And if you read certain media articles, especially after what happened in December, you would think that tornado frequency has doubled over the last year. And we're going to see December tornadoes that hit major metro areas every single year. What happened in Mayfield, Kentucky, all due respect to that was absolutely awful. And something I'm grateful to say is fairly rare. There are some subtle changes going on. The hotspots indicate where the traditional tornado alley has cooled off, is shown in the blue, and then the red spots show where it has started to light up in parts of the lower Mississippi and central Mississippi Valley. Notice also that for portions of Pennsylvania and along the lowlands to the east and parts of New York State, you do have a slow upward drift in days that could produce a significant tornado. And again, this is something that we have observed in environments where the atmosphere was charged and ready to produce a significant tornado. They don't all produce, but when the environment is there, you could argue that the risk is there. And there are some changes that we need to be aware of, especially for the Midwest, parts of the Deep South, and to a lesser extent, parts of the Mid-Atlantic region. And there are some subtle trends that are going on that we need to be aware of, again, from a strategic planning and ERM perspective, and awareness that the CAP models might not be capturing all of these trends. So this slide says a lot of what I just said. There's not a need to repeat it, but what I want to address is some discussion of projections and what they're telling us. I've talked about what we've observed, what we've seen. There's a lot of variability from year to year, crazy variability, in fact. Projections are unclear, but it is clear that the severe convective season will likely lengthen and drift further north. So these December tornadoes will not be going away. We've seen them before, but they are really rare. The last time we saw an upper Midwest tornado outbreak was in 1974, according to the recorded historical record. But they will not be going away, and hopefully they're not going to occur every year. So that seasonality shift is tricky, and Ed raised that earlier. If you think of a hockey game with an additional period, an additional 20 minutes of play, the score is probably going to go up, even if the risk on a minute-by-minute basis for scoring a goal hasn't changed all that much. So this is something to be conscious of, and it affects anybody with a severe thunderstorm exposure. The other guidance in the academic literature is telling us most likely we will see a busier spring and possibly a quieter summer. And the crazy variability that we see from year to year will absolutely not be going away. And that too is something to be aware of. So that's severe thunderstorms. Let me talk briefly about wildfire. My clicker is sluggish. Maybe it's just, whoops. It's lagged, that's what the issue is. Concerning wildfire, there's some interesting trends going on. Wildfires like to spread in very hot, very dry periods, especially if they last a long time or following a period of excessive drought. And if you get rainy seasons in between or rainy periods in between, it can help find vegetation to grow, which serves as fuel for the next hot and dry period when wildfires can spread again. Unequivocally, the number of days that can support wildfire growth are increasing, especially true in the West. And when you think about the Jersey Pine Barrens, we do get hot and dry periods where things can happen, and in portions of Pennsylvania as well. Not to the same severity as what we see in California, but it's there and we need to be aware of it. There are some things that you could do about wildfire from a resilience perspective, keeping screens on your vents, keeping a defensible space around your property, keeping the firewood away from your property. These are all things that can make a difference to reducing the effects of wildfire spread on a home. And the Institute for Business and Home Safety has done some very, very nice work along these lines concerning wildfire. They've done some great work around hail and wind as well. Just gonna fill this out real quick. Actually, before we go there, let me talk about the picture at the bottom. What we're looking at here is something from a long time ago from Charlie back in 2004. The IBHS did a study following Hurricane Charlie for properties that were affected in Charlotte County, where Charlie made landfall as a category for a hurricane. And what we're looking at here are pictures of the effects of the 94 building codes that went into effect in the state of Florida following Hurricane Andrew. There's a year or two lag before this stuff really takes shape for new construction. But what the IBHS found, if you look at the picture on the right, the claims frequency dropped by over half for those homes that were built post 94 to those more recent building codes. And claims severity dropped considerably as well. This stuff has been field tested and found to make a difference. And as these building codes have gained traction across the country, and especially in the state of Florida, we can think carefully about code adaptation. Some states are better than others. The IBHS has a rating the states report that might be of value. At retrofit time, there are certain measures that can make a difference. I should point out that anything built prior to 1970 in this county was basically scraped right down to the ground as a very unpleasant example of what a lack of codes can do in terms of construction. We always like it when homeowners have a place where they can shelter following the storm. And this is a field test with hard evidence that this stuff makes a difference, even if it is an older example. For wind, a continuous load path from the roof through the walls into the foundation can drastically increase resilience. Building code is a minimum. From a life safety perspective, the IBHS has what they call a fortified standard that augments these codes with additional measures to support structural resilience. Pennsylvania codes and standards are available at the website here. There's some good stuff in there. And at the time of new construction and retrofit is a kind of a longer time scale period where you can look after this stuff. And there are things that homeowners can do in the meantime, again, documented by the ABHS to reduce the threat of low-grade wind damage. It won't stop an EF4 tornado, but 95% of tornadoes are EF2 and weaker. That's a range where this stuff can really make a difference. When it comes to coastal flooding and inland flood, those are really threats where community resilience really comes into play. The same is true to an extent for wildfire. And action very much needs to initiate at the local level, and there are federal funds available to help with resilience measures when it comes to flood, stormwater retention plans, rainwater catchment areas, drainage at a municipal level. These are all things that can help, and flood protection for coastal areas. So these are things that can make a difference and something that we can do about it. With that, thank you very much. It's great to speak with you today, and I'll turn it over to Tim for questions and comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Any question or comments? Oh, yeah, hold on. No, it's obstacles here.
With all the data and research you look at, patterns, trends, what you see, what you don't see, from an insurance perspective, property-wise, what's your biggest concern?
Coastal flood. That's very pressing. It's an unequivocal trend that is apparent in observed data and projected to continue. Regardless of whether you're a wind-only rider or not, that's something that can affect anything at a lower elevation adjacent to either coastal areas or connected waterways like the lower Schuylkill River or Delaware Bay or otherwise. And I would argue that any interest in the mid-Atlantic is sensitive to this stuff, whether you're right wind-only or flood or otherwise. From a flood perspective, I believe with the legislative dance and in a direction towards actuarially sound rates or rates more consistent with the risk, that there is an increasing place for the private sector to play in the insurance of flood. And there are companies that are going there bit by bit with an appetite in reinsurers for the right approach to go there as well. When it comes to severe thunderstorm and wildfire, the threats are more attritional in nature. And the way you can really get ahead of that, and then I'll turn it over to Ed for the comments. It's going to show a slide here. If I could get the folks in the back to bring the screen back up. Got the perfect slide to speak to this. Let me just advance here real quick. The way you can get ahead of it on the attritional side and maybe the subcat stuff. This is not advancing. Catastrophe models obviously have their place, but they're dated. We have maps that tell us the hot spots and cold spots for severe convective risk across the country. Does it allow us to differentiate from house to house? No. But say between North Texas and South Texas, or the Appalachians versus coastal portions of Maryland or DC, we can get a sense of the hot spots and cold spots so that we can look these risks in the eye and treat them appropriately according to the portfolio. And that's another tool that can help. Being aware of the pain points in a portfolio. If you take that Joplin outline that I was talking about earlier and run that over the portfolio, there will be some pain points that come out, and being aware of those and treating them appropriately. It'll look different for everybody in the room, but that's another lens that you can use for treatment of severe convective risk and to help us to see through the fog a little bit. And then the resilience measures, like I mentioned earlier, that's another important piece of it. So those are some things that we can do about it. Long-winded answer to your question. First of all, coastal flood, and then subtle for the others. Thanks. Ed, any follow-up?
A ditto. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the things as well, and I really liked the point that you make, wrong, less wrong, and useless. I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. But I think that there also is a component right now that concerns me, at least. It's what are we putting into these models? And, many of you have probably seen, portfolios, or even personally, you've got, whether it's Marshall Swift Beck or Logic, E2, you have these valuations that are completely changing. And so there's the understanding of well, what is the actual size of risk, whether it's a severe convective storm, whether it's flooding, whether it's a hurricane. I think we're in such a uncertain period right now that that's I think a current concern in terms of, and this is not a pitch to buy reinsurance. I'm saying it's more of just, if we don't know a potential amount of loss, how can we steer around that? So this is, again, I completely agree, geospatial solutions, understanding those pain points, that I think becomes even more and more critical as we advance into an area of climate change where it's clear that there is something happening, right? Whether the trends are there or not, in terms of like being able to act on that. And that I think then as we go forward, it's just, being able to manage that portfolio.
Any other questions? Ed, how about a guess on your inflation? We got to put you on the spot here. So you're showing us that scary number of what, 7.9? My eyes were squinting at it. So what do you think it's going to be? You want to take a stab at 2022? I mean, I guess doing an average annual, or what's your guess on that?
You know what? It's funny. I right before this, I got from a meeting where we were discussing that exact fact, where it's like, all right, but if we had to pick one number, right, what would we pick? I think I would have to say, and one of the best lessons I learned from my MBA was you never give a point estimate. You always give a range. But I think ultimately it's really, we have to look at this as like a best case, base case, or worst case. And I think a large portion of this, and I think it's going to continue to see potential increases as we are now, maybe even more. I think that the challenge really on a global basis, particularly with the crisis in Ukraine, that I think has all the makings for, there's kind of where is it going to go from here? But I've also seen indices that, some are saying 6% across the year, some are saying 25% across the year. Of course, that's going to differ based on, what it is that we're looking at as well. Like, what is it, a producer pricing? Is it, lumber? Is it steel? But it's also the transportation, right? So I have to, get stuff from one place to the next, and gas prices increasing doesn't make that any cheaper. So I think we're going to see not necessarily a transitional period. So I don't think we're going to go back to 2% this summer. I think we will have eventually reaching more normal, or like, let's call it, kind of what we're used to. But I don't think that will be into 2023 at least. So I think you could see 5 to 7% throughout the rest of the year.
Okay, we're gonna come back next year and
yeah, exactly. Somebody write that down. Let's see where it ends up.
It's a little dangerous putting a weather person with you on this. I could see that some say that being a meteorologist is the best profession out there, next to being an economist. So I'll let the audience decide. Anyway, if I don't see any more hands, so we might be able to let you out a little early here. That's all right with all. We want to thank Jim and Ed. How about a round of applause for that fine presentation?
Well, thank you for having me. It was really.
And feel free to send us any updates on these predictions we're talking about, especially Ed.
I've got my crystal ball. It's ready to go for it.
And then we just want to thank the audience for coming for the 2022 Spring Annual Conference live mostly, and our friends that were a dozen or so that were virtual. It's terrific. Next event, first off, if you did CE, make sure you sign out in the lobby. And the next event is a claims summit in April. I think you saw the sign outside there. And we wish everyone to have safe travels home, and see you at the next PAMIC event. Thank you.
Thank you.